Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am speaking with Benjamin Norris. Benjamin is a philosopher, researcher, professor. He has his PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, and he is the author of the book Schelling and Spinoza, Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute. And this is the book we talk about, and this is why I wanted to get him on the podcast. I saw the book, I read it, it was very, very good, and I really enjoyed it. I've talked about Spinoza before on the podcast, but not Schelling, really, not with any kind of longevity there with talking about Schelling. He's kind of been mentioned. And yeah, I read the book and I said, okay, this is really, really, really cool stuff, and I want to read it and or talk to him about it. And so we had a very long conversation. This conversation is over 3 hours. It's one of my long ones, and I was super proud of it because it's dense. It's a dense conversation. It's a lot of detail, which is what I really like. It's some pretty tough ideas in here. There's even a few places where I was like, okay, wait, what? Let me follow this. And that's not a fault of Ben by any means. He's an exceptional teacher. You can tell he's a teacher, and he's very good at explaining these things. It's just some of these concepts are so damn difficult. But we talk about all of these things over 3 hours. And I absolutely enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening back to it. Really, really good stuff. And so I'm really, really happy for everyone to listen to it. We started by talking about how he came to write his book on Schelling and Spinoza, why he focuses on idealism, realism, this kind of hyphenated term. We talk about try to define idealism and realism and some of the difficulties there. Talk about the three claims of idealism. We talk about Spinoza's ethics. We talk about the importance of Jacoby's critiques on German idealism, Spinoza's God, the infinite and finite, modes and attributes of substance. We talk about the principle of sufficient reason, Kant's synthetic judgments. We spent some time talking about Schelling's philosophy of nature, which I was really excited to talk about. We spent a good bit of time on that. We talk about that shift of Schelling from philosophy of nature to philosophy of identity. We talk about the absolute. We talk about blotobjectivism. We talk about Kant's antinomies. We talk about the problem of evil. We talk about Schelling's notion of potentials. We talk about Žižek's three phases of Schelling's philosophy, and we talk about Schelling's tripartite-tripartite soul. Again, wide-ranging, whole lots of stuff in here. Really, really good. Not even an introduction, or not even a cursory thing. It was a really good deep dive into Schelling, which makes me happy. And I'm sure that many people will enjoy that. He's got some really interesting ideas towards the end there when we talk about his kind of shift later in life to kind of more of the religious ideas. As can happen, I get worked up, and you start to hear my criticisms of just Christianity in general and some of Schelling's work there. But it was a fantastic conversation. Ben's a wonderful person, super brilliant, and really good at explaining a lot of these hard concepts. And so now I bring you Benjamin Norris. I am here with Benjamin Norris. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, hey Xavier, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so you've written a really awesome book. It's called Schelling and Spinoza: Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute. It's going to be wonderful to talk about the philosophy of Schelling here, which I've talked about a little bit with a few other people, but really just get the full download here. So before we do that, just tell folks who you are, what your background is, anything relevant there, and currently what you're currently doing, and anything else.
Yeah, great. So I finished my PhD from the New School for Social Research in 2021. Recently started teaching over at Rowan University in New Jersey. So I've been very pleased to be teaching in person again.
Oh yeah,
feels like I'm actually doing philosophy again, which is so nice. in the works right now, doing some job application stuff, working on an essay for Kabiri, which is the official journal of the Schelling Society, North American Schelling Society.
Very nice.
And kind of just, kicking around some ideas, trying to get organized, trying to figure out where to go from here after finishing the book.
Yeah, no, that's. I think there's probably some freedom in that. Obviously, probably some, anxiety too. Always next steps, what's going to happen. But I think that having kind of open possibilities is great, and you certainly have shown your chops of sorts of being able to be obviously a good writer, but then obviously very good at understanding. Probably idealism at large, and then Schelling in particular. Now, I guess so. We'll focus on Schelling, but is that like kind of your focus, or was it German idealism broadly, or did you have some work with Spinoza? Like, kind of what when you were studying, what was like your kind of main nucleus of focus?
Yeah, so kind of setting up how I got to this research project. I was initially very interested in contemporary continental philosophy. And so I was reading through Deleuze and then Badiou, and then sort of lesser known French thinker named Francois Lavelle. And throughout all of these theorists, they place a really heavy emphasis on the notion of immanence, right? And this idea that immanence is able to solve a series of philosophical problems that were inherited by 20th and 21st century philosophy. So my interest in that, combined with an interest in psychoanalysis, sort of led me to Žižek, right? And then that brought me back into German idealism. So I come to the problems of German idealism from the perspective of these contemporary continental theorists who are really interested in both immanence, right? And then also the problem of realism. So that's kind of where those two interests into the work of Schelling came from. So I was looking at the relationship between Kant and Spinoza, and the role that Spinoza played in what's known as the pantheism controversy in Germany. And I found in these readings of Spinoza a sort of very interesting kind of critical line. And so the curiosity was then, how can we follow through with that critical line in order to better understand the sort of latent role that Spinozism continues to play in contemporary philosophical discourse? So I kind of got there through the reverse, which is, why the work is a little bit, I would say, broader than some of the more technical texts on Schelling.
Yeah, I think it's really nice because obviously Schelling by himself is great, but I think as I was reading the book, having this kind of juxtaposition, because a lot of things build off of each other, right? So, what were his interactions with, Spinoza, and obviously you mentioned Kant in there and a few other folks, and what these various concepts they're trying to kind of wrestle with or discuss is actually really, really nice, because it almost feels technical, obviously, but it almost feels like a dialogue of sorts of like, oh yeah, like, well, he was saying this, but he was totally wrong there, or he didn't get that right, or this is a wrong lens to look at this, and here's another perspective. And so it's nice to kind of have it instead of just kind of like a, here's one of these guys' philosophy by itself. So it's great. Okay, so yeah, so it's just, you've kind of started there. So let's just talk about, I guess, like the main thesis of the book, of why Schelling and Spinoza, and then how you, we'll do a lot of defining of terms, I'm sure, of realism, idealism, but yeah, and how is he trying, how does the book try to bridge the gap between these two thinkers with eminence, as you mentioned, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say the main thesis of the book is that the contemporary relevance of the sort of area of Schelling's work that I focus on in the book can best be understood as, reinterpreting or representing these familiar terms that we have, realism and idealism. But, what I really try to do is focus on this phrase that he uses, ideal realism, where he hyphenates ideal hyphen realism. And so the idea there is that there's something really significant about this hyphen. So in order to understand, what kind of realist or what kind of idealist Schelling is, we have to start at that middle point and work our way out. So that's sort of the general thesis of the book. And then the sort of other part of it is methodological. And the methodology that I propose is to read Schelling through his critical engagement with Spinoza. In Schelling scholarship, there's sort of there's a couple different orientations. There was initially this idea that, Schelling never really completed his system. There's a phrase that he, carried out his philosophical education in public. So he's kind of compared, right, to his former friend, contemporary Hegel, who, came up with this grand systematic endeavor. And folks looked at Schelling and said, well, there are sort of these, they divided it into three phases, three distinct areas of his project. But then commentators started focusing on the role that the philosophy of nature continues to play throughout his thinking. So I'm thinking particularly Ian Hamilton Grant wrote a very influential book, Philosophies of Nature After Schelling, that takes this thesis that throughout his work, Schelling is doing nature philosophy, right? So even though we might see on the surface level these three semi-discontinuous phases, that there is an underlying commonality between all three of them. And this thesis has been picked up. There's a number of folks kind of working with a similar presupposition, even though they take it in somewhat different directions. And what I wanted to do with the engagement with Spinoza was be able to sort of highlight continuities and discontinuities within Schelling's work as he returns to Spinoza. Schelling was obviously a prolific reader of the history of philosophy, so he had no, shortage of figures to draw on as he's writing. But throughout his work, you see him continuously returning to Spinoza over and over again. So I thought that, again, the method would provide sort of an interesting picture of a through line that can be constructed in Schelling's philosophy. Because as anyone who has any familiarity with Schelling's writing knows, the texts are incredibly complex, and it's at certain points in time really hard to understand how he's getting from point A to point B to point C. The way that the series of issues that he's working through in different texts, right? How do these issues address each other? And so by taking this sort of reading Schelling as a reader perspective, I wanted to propose a new way of understanding how Schelling would have understood his own project in relationship to this focal point that he continuously comes back to, right? Namely Spinoza. So that's, the sort of two-pronged, I would say, thesis of the book.
Yeah, no, it's you explain that really well. We can come back to the ideal realism thing, but I guess one way I want to ask this is, or excuse me, I want to talk about his philosophy of nature. That I find it really, really fascinating. With the idealism realism aspect, and you said it was hyphenated. I think in the book you say that the realism is the flesh and the idealism is the soul. And so, how is there a shared aim in relation to human freedom and the absolute with this idealism realism? So, maybe we can define both first of how is, at least for Schelling and maybe Spinoza if it's different, how are we defining idealism and how are we defining realism, and then how do they have a shared aim with human freedom and then the absolute?
Yeah, absolutely. So the quote that you're making reference to comes from the 1809 philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom, and the way that he invokes it there is he talks about how the idealist conception of freedom is what he calls too formal, right? So it doesn't yet have that kind of real ground. And I think we'll get into this later. But, for Schelling, one of the most important aspects of human freedom is the fact that there's a choice between good and evil, right? So one of the things that he's looking at is not just what are the formal conditions of me being free, but what does the world have to be like such that I'm able to actualize this free decision between good and evil. And in terms of the general question of how does he define idealism and how does he define realism, I find that point to be a little bit stickier, right? Especially when we try to, let's say retrospectively project the way that we understand realism and idealism in contemporary terms, when we try to, put that back onto Schelling, I'm not convinced that it's quite so easy, right? He's not a scientific realist. He's not necessarily a critical realist. He's not necessarily an internal or external realist, right? All of these different forms of realism. And, his idealism, it's not strictly Kantian, and it's not strictly Fichtean. It's not a subjective idealism. And so there are a bunch of negative determinations that we can make about the relation of realism and idealism in Schelling's work. But one of the things that the book tries to show is how that relation is actually quite messy. In these various cases in the text, we can see that, he's going to talk about how within the real, there's always going to be an ideal. And the same is true with the ideal. And in his early discussions of the relationships between nature philosophy and transcendental philosophy, he relates these, again, through the language of the real and ideal, and the idea that the goal of nature philosophy is to idealize its internal principle and arrive at transcendental philosophy. And transcendental philosophy works in the opposite direction, right? So it's supposed to realize the principle of the philosophy of nature, right, that emerges from within it. So again, it's this. It's just not as simple as saying, well, realism for Schelling is X, and idealism for Schelling is Y. It's this kind of morphing inheritance of these various strands of thought that he's going to, we could say, adjust.
It seems as if you're describing it that there's a reciprocal relationship here, right? That right. On both sides of it. So the realism, is animating the idealism, but then also the reverse. Idealism is animating the realism, at least on his view of things. Is that about right? Like there's a kind of two-way street going here?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I read it. The idea is, beginning with the essay that I look at in the second chapter of the book, the philosophical letters on dogmatism and criticism, he's quite explicit about the fact that realism, right, or dogmatism, as he puts it in that essay, which is drawn from Spinoza, is able to address some really, really important issues, right? Very important philosophical issues, while at the same point in time, the critical perspective is able to do the same thing, right? We have to understand not just the way that our minds understand the world, right, and come to know the world, but we also have to think about the way the world is, such that this kind of mindedness is possible, right? So the latter question is unanswerable by idealism, and the former question is unanswerable by realism alone. So that's why we need this intertwining, or as I put it, interpenetrating of the two doctrines in order to, again, grasp not just what it is to be a human that's capable of understanding the world, but also understanding what the world is like, such that there are humans who can understand it.
So there's something interesting here that I promise we'll get to it, but I want to just leave it for its own thing. Is his philosophy of nature. Spinoza also had a system of a science of nature. I'm also thinking about some of Heidegger's ideas about worldhood. Also, I think Sartre had said some things. There's when you get to the phenomenologists and existentialists, they have also different perspectives. So maybe we can, again, sort of hyperlink it of sorts. But I guess there's these three claims, right, of idealism, which are the ultimate contingent reality is wholly mental, ultimate contingent reality is wholly non-physical, and that the physical world is the logical product of facts about human sense experience. So maybe just kind of map out for us or kind of expound upon those three claims.
Yeah, great. So the reason why I chose to frame the discussion of idealism initially with reference to those three claims is to kind of outline how the rejection of idealism in a lot of contemporary philosophy depends upon a certain picture of idealism. Right? So when we have this idea that ultimate contingent reality is wholly mental, one of the, I think, a sort of semi-realist thinker who embraces this, right, is someone like Whitehead. So ultimate contingent reality being wholly mental can incorporate within itself certain forms of panpsychism. And then the second one, that ultimate contingent reality is wholly non-physical. This, I think, is the primary definition that the realist critics of idealism want to use. And part of what I try to show in the book is that this is sort of a straw man. I'm sure that there are folks who have held this claim in its strongest possible form, but at the same point in time, I don't think it's really the boogeyman that it's presented of as idealism. And then finally, we have this idea that the physical world is the logical product about facts of human sense experience. And the idea there is that there's something that human sense experience necessarily contributes to, right, reality. So one of the ways of thinking about this is, it's possible that there's a real that's semi-independent of mindedness. But at the same point in time, mindedness is necessary for organizing that real into what we would call an intelligible world. So these three different perspectives, after outlining them, I try to draw out the way that Schelling's idealism isn't really reducible to any of these. Schelling's idealism has to do with really following Kant in a reawakening of the notion of the idea drawn from Plato. So some of Schelling's earliest writings were about Plato's Timaeus and the roles that something like ideas played in creation. So for the idea, for Schelling, it's not a component of mindedness, or it's not reducible to a component of mindedness. And unlike what some readers of Plato might say, it's not a form that's way out there. The idea itself is a kind of organizing principle between reality and ideality. So unlike these, three characterizations of idealism that do depend on categories of mindedness, I think in Schelling, there's a kind of idealism that's not reducible to those pictures. And because of that, this is what allows Schelling's idealism to, in a certain sense, avoid some of the critiques of these contemporary realist philosophers who, see Kant as this great philosophical disease that must be overcome.
Right. Okay, so let's try and use an example here. If you have a particular one, you go for it. But if I go out on a hike, so I live in Appalachia, so there's mountains around here. It's a nice time of year with all the fall foliage. I'm going to be walking about in the world. And I mean, you can do this in your house or in your room or something. I'm just trying to use it as a good visual aid. And I see the trees, and I see the sky, and I see the sun, and I see, nature. And I see maybe, I drove there to take a hike, and I got in a car and I drove on a road, and some of the things of modernity, etc. In this way, those things exist, and they are. And they exist whether I come into contact with them or not. But in these conceptions of mindedness, I want to understand that, because I don't think that they're saying that there's a value placed on it, or is there a type of like a type of hierarchy that's placed there. So it's like, well, these things are going to exist, and obviously the world has existed beforehand, but it doesn't matter until you come into contact with it, or you're not going to know it in a particular way, or that there's some aspect of who you are that's, not changing it, but impacting it. How do we understand these ideas of human sense experience in our physical world as interacting with how we're understanding it and understanding the basic principles of existence and reality, dependent on how we're approaching it or not. I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't know if that's a good analogy or visual aid, but you tell me.
Yeah, sometimes I have a hard time working with examples, to be perfectly honest. But I mean, I guess the way that I would begin to outline it would be, again, with reference to Kant, right? And his famous phrase that concepts without intuitions are empty, but intuitions without concepts are blind. Right? So Kant is going to say something like, you walking through the forest, the intelligibility is not given to you by nature itself. Right? You bring the intelligibility to that experience. And he's got a very complex story.
You're having a concept of what you're experiencing, right? Before you even get there, you're already mapping it on to what the experience of like is walking in a forest, what it smells like, what it's going to be like, how trees are. They should be this height, not 2 feet tall. They should be 20 feet tall. Or what? Like you're coming to it already with priors, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So if you're using your determinative judgments, what he calls determinative judgments, what he works through in the first critique, you're bringing a certain amount of structure to it, right? So the intelligibility of the world is not necessarily just given to you through intuitions alone. Right? So there is this element of mindedness that's necessary. And then when we look at sort of what Kant means by determinative conceptual intelligibility, we get to what Allison calls the discursivity thesis. Right. So, and then the idea there is that it's not just that we bring concepts to the world, we have this sort of discursive structure of understanding. And one of the things that's really important about this thesis is it helps us better understand the way that we as individuals constitute the world we experience. Right. But then the fear that opens up is, well, what if we're over-constituting the world? Right. Through our experience, right? And this is the worry of subjective idealisms, right? That all of this is just too much dependent upon my own self-positing and positing in relationship to the passive objects of nature. And this is going to lead into what Schelling's critique of Fichte is, which I'm guessing we'll end up talking about a little bit. But so again, the idea is that for Schelling, we need an analysis of those kind of ideal structures of mindedness. But we have to remember that those ideal structures of mindedness are embedded, in the world or in nature itself. So Ben Woodard, who's one of these Schelling scholars that's really interested in the naturalism thesis, he makes a claim that my relation to the bird on the branch, right, when I'm perceiving it, when I'm conceptualizing it, when I'm trying to understand that relationship, all of those processes are just as natural as the bird on the branch itself, right? So, and this is how those kind of ideal structures of intelligibility are connected to and even emergent from nature. So does that kind of begin?
It really does go to the reciprocal nature, because what it's saying is that you also are an organism, and you also are in nature, and you also are interacting with something that has impact, right? The bird on the branch, the flower on the ground, or whatever. That now obviously other organisms or other, especially sentient ones, such as, birds or, other animals, who knows what it's like to be one of those. So they may also have their own ideas about, how they're, we know certain animals, see the world literally differently, different types of vision and stuff. But in terms of who we are and how we're placed in a certain environment or a certain context, yes, that absolutely makes sense of that there is this kind of, you're not outside of it, you're a part of it. Kind of thing.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. And, Schelling is even going to go so far to say that system of understanding itself has an organic structure. And so the relationship of parts to whole in our system of understanding of the world is, in a certain sense, analogous to the part-whole relationship in an organism. Right. So this is where his notion of life comes into play. Right? This idea that life, when he's talking about life, he's not just talking about animal life or human life, He's even describing the life of God or the life of the absolute itself, right? Or the life of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, an important connection there between not just the fact that we encounter organisms in nature, but there's something organistic about that very encounter. If that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. So I'm trying to think of like a kind of a rebuttal here of I'll interact with people and they'll say, what's the but that's all subjective. That there will be some people that claim this, that's just your vantage point, but there is an objective reality, right? So like if you look at like, the theory of, general relativity and how we understand, physics and how we understand, the universe and the world and all these things, like those are just objective things that are true. It has no point of connection necessarily with how our subjectivity is there. And I wonder on that point, and people do this with truth as well, but that's a separate conversation. But I guess how do you kind of respond to those types of claims, or how would, I guess, Schelling or any of these guys respond to those types of claims?
Yeah, so sort of, I think the smoothest entry point into an answer to this question for me would be to return to Spinoza, right? Mm-hmm. And what is it that Spinoza offers? So the way that I see it and the way that I read the ethics is the fundamental goal of the ethics is to understand how explanation is possible, right? Mm-hmm. What does the world have to be like such that we can explain it? Mm-hmm. And in order to be able to explain it, we need to assume, in a certain sense, that the principle of sufficient reason, all right, this idea that for every cause, there's an effect, and the relationship between cause and effect is one, necessary, and two, intelligible, right? That the world, in a certain sense, has to be, let's say, contained within that condition such that we can be able to explain the way it is, and explain the way it is independent of a subjective perspective. Right? So that's kind of, I think, where Spinoza and this sort of rationalism that I think actually plays an important part in Schelling's work as well comes into play, right? Because both Schelling and Spinoza are really interested in explaining the world without, again, particular reference to a certain form of mindedness. So when we accept the principle of sufficient reason as constitutive of reality, right, it allows us to give explanations that aren't reducible to or dependent upon subjective experiences alone.
So that if somebody now and somebody 100 years from now could look at these statements or look at these ideas, they could find almost like a plug and play. They could find the same thing, regardless of their subjective experience of it. They might, not to say that they wouldn't have one, but that at the foundational level, these things are true about this with just these kind of cause and effect framework of sorts. You obviously can have subjective experiences of things, and that is part of those things. But at bottom, these things are as best as possible trying to remove that element. Is that about right?
Yeah, something like that. Another point of reference that I think might be helpful is so a French philosopher, Quentin Meillassoux, wrote a book called After Finitude that I guess came out about 20 years ago now. But one of the things that he frames in that book, he's criticizing subjective idealism, what he calls correlationism. And in order to refute this idea that there needs to be some kind of relationship between a subject and an object in order for knowledge to be possible, he goes through a couple of different examples of things that we know, but fundamentally would not be able to experience, right? Okay. So his preferred example, right, is the creation of the universe, right? Okay. We know by way of, various forms of carbon dating, various forms of mathematical analysis, we can have a general understanding of how old the universe is, right? And this is quite an incredible fact, given that we would never, in principle, be able to experience that moment, right? So there's a sense in which explanation, right, depends upon a sort of rational supervenience over experience. So experience is a pocket in this sort of larger system, and it's obviously a very important aspect of how we as individuals engage with the world.
Right.
But experience itself doesn't necessarily give to us the categorical structure of the world as a whole. And we need to be able to engage in this other practice of providing rational explanations, in a certain sense, precisely to undercut this idea that the entire meaning of the world is subjectively dependent.
So this is his critique. So this is not exactly what Spinoza and Schelling are saying. They're saying something different.
So I think that again, because of the focus on explanation, right? So Spinoza thought that we could fully explain, substance. We have the capacity to do that. Schelling, for his part, I think really latches on to this idea as well, right? So in his early philosophy, he's explaining the relationship between the self-positing I and the form of philosophy. He's explaining the dynamics of nature. He's explaining the entire history of self-consciousness. But then eventually, he is providing explanations for the creation of the world out of God. He's providing rational explanations in his late philosophy of revelation about the revelation of God, right? There's nothing sort of amorphous or outside of the realm of intelligibility for these things. We can give, according to Schelling, an explanation for so much of this. So I do think that there's this really important broader perspective that both of them share in terms of their commitment to what we as rational creatures are able to do. And I think, to bring it back to Meillassoux, it combines with what his overall goal in that project is. So the book ends with this wonderful sentence about how the task of philosophy is to reconcile thought and the absolute, right? To once again realize that our thinking is not reducible to or fully dependent upon what our personal experiences are. It's a kind of anti-phenomenological tenet within the way that these folks are thinking about these really difficult metaphysical questions that certain traditions of philosophy would say those are pseudo problems, or those are issues for science, or this kind of stuff. Spinoza and Schelling are going to refuse to do that kind of dividing of labor.
So you talk about in the second chapter, I don't remember, it's one of the early chapters, you talk about the role of Jacoby, right? And there's this kind of conversation going on about what his thoughts were for idealism and anti-realism. And so, and you also talk about like his ideas with, Fichte's philosophy as a inverted Spinozanism. So I guess just kind of tell about like Jacoby and what he was trying to say with this kind of debate with idealism and why it's important here, and then maybe some of his interactions with Fichte and maybe Spinoza.
Yeah, absolutely. So Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi was a really influential figure in the development of German idealism. He wasn't himself a German idealist, but he was a pretty prominent theologian, novelist, and he played this kind of incendiary role in spurring forth what the post-Kantians would try to work through. So they weren't just trying to figure out, the gaps in the critical project, or how do we correct Kant such that we can fulfill our goals. They were also responding to this criticism that comes out of Jacobi about what happens when we expand the scope of reason too far, right? And so the way that Jacobi comes into play in the first chapter of the book is it's trying to, one, provide a historical foundation for, again, the sort of nexus of philosophical issues that were percolating as Schelling was working on his earlier theories, but also to destabilize what's become the equivocation between realist philosophies and philosophies of immanence. So for Jacoby, what was very important in order to avoid what he calls the nihilism of Fichte or the atheism of Spinoza was the idea that there has to be something absolutely transcendent. Right? And through that absolute transcendence, this is where we get realism. Yeah, go ahead.
So just on that, is that coming out of his theological backgrounds? Like he's trying to do a little smuggling of some, like, supreme being or God or whatever. Is that coming from this, or is it kind of removed from that?
No, so smuggling would be a generous way to put it. I mean, he is just unabashed. He says
propaganda, just proselytizing people.
Well, right. So the idea is that one of the common criticisms of Spinoza, and it really dates back very far, is the idea that in referring to substance as God or nature with the inclusive or, right? So substance is God and nature, that in collapsing the relationship there, on the one hand, you rob God of a particular type of authority, right? An autonomy that is granted to God through Scripture. Right. The idea of God as a transcendent and external creator of the world, right? God as a freely acting cause that begets creation, but is not in turn determined by that creation that he begets, right? And basically what Jacoby is saying is that if there isn't that point that's external to reason, then there's no ground for it, right? So he talks about how the idealist loses what he calls the thing, right? Because to bring it back to the introduction of the book, one of the sort of characteristics of realism is this idea of the independence thesis. And there has to be something in the world that's independent of human-mindedness in order to call it a kind of realism, right? So with that in mind, we can see how both Spinoza and Fichte, right, when they have these sort of totalizing systems of understanding, and they would eliminate that sort of, that external kernel upon which, right, thoughts would find their grounding. And this is why, right, Jacoby is going to reintegrate in a very heavy way the category of faith. He refers to himself as a non-philosopher. Right? He doesn't claim to be a philosopher because he ultimately thinks that all philosophy is going to lead to a kind of atheism and nihilism, again, because of its faith in the capacity of what reason can do. So he's going to say, because there has to be this infinite distance between the creator and what is created,
right, we
can only come to, let's say, be assured of the reality of that creation through faith. Because if we try to use reason, then we collapse that gap, right? And we fall back into this problem of the equivocation of God and world. So there's this sort of theological element to it. But what I really try to focus on in that chapter is the way that Jacoby himself also saw realism as a solution or an antidote to the problems of idealism. So again, we have this picture of, overblown, bloated idealism where everything is subjective and there's no real world. And the only way to sort of salvage that is to introduce a form of realism and reject idealism. And so I want to say that growing out of some of the encounters with those texts, Schelling rejects that false dichotomy that you have to be either an idealist or a realist.
It's interesting how he's trying to bridge them together of sorts, which goes back again to the beginning of what you were saying about the hyphenated aspect of it. And I guess just there, so how does he get these ideas with, I guess, Fichte's philosophy of inverted Spinozism, and then, how in this way, you mentioned in the book how Fichte and Spinoza are just two sides of a single problem. Maybe just chat about that a little bit based on what Jacoby's, thinking about here.
Yeah. So again, the relation there has to do with the idea of totalization. right?
Okay.
So he's going to say that that any consistent philosophy has to be what he calls a philosophy of one piece, right? There can't be these sort of, disparate elements, some things that can be known, some things that can't be known, right? That's not true to the aspiration of, right, the sort of systematizing philosophical projects, right, in the idealists, and also in Spinoza in his own way. So, and Schelling really, I think, elucidates this thought nicely when he says, the problem with Spinozism is that the subject is completely annihilated in the objective world. So for Spinoza, there's only the object. Whereas for Fichte, he, according to Jacoby, and Schelling picks up on this somewhat as well, annihilates the objective world by completely consuming it within the subjective sphere. So both are left with, we could say, a sort of partial picture of the world, unable to understand the constitutive and contributing factors that both subjectivity and objectivity play in philosophical systematicity. And again, Jacoby is going to dismiss philosophy as a whole because he thinks that fundamental to it is this totalizing aspiration. And looking at sort of, again, his contemporary Fichte, and then, sort of major influence Spinoza, he sees that occurring as well. There is no externality that's levered over. So in that sense, there is no reality, because reality is equated with externality.
Yeah, it's just very interesting how he's picking up on like kind of these ways in which it's incomplete. It's not completely complete, and it's Schelling becomes more interesting because he's trying to bridge it, is what it feels. It feels that way, and then bridging it as again within nature. So let's talk about Spinoza's God here in the substance. So we talked about it. I have to say, Spinoza is interesting. He's tough in some ways. If I understand him right, if there's a God, I prefer it's Spinoza's God. So people will see why in a minute. I did have a conversation with who was it that I had on here? Nadler, I think. Yes, I had it with. And we talked about a little bit of Spinoza. I think that's right. But we didn't get into super deep. So, just kind of give us the overview, and then where it becomes important here, because I will keep mentioning Spinoza. So, Spinoza has his God. He talks about the one substance. It's, I believe, in the Ethics and maybe other places. So, and then he talks about finite and infinite, and it gets a little dense trying to parse some of that stuff out sometimes. So, kind of explain to us Spinoza's idea here and what he was trying to do, and then we'll probably get into some of the criticisms he received.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess to start with what Spinoza was trying to do, the way that I understand it, and again, this comes back to the problem of explicability, right? The problem of what does reality have to be like such that we're able to give explanations of it. And there's a sense in which he's picking up on certain elements of Descartes' philosophy and continuing or drawing them out to what he sees as their most extreme form. Right? So there's kind of an open question about, first off, right, why is the book called The Ethics? It doesn't necessarily have all that much to do with ethics.
Right.
Book 4 and 5 begin to engage with these problems. But I think that one way to look at it is, if we're committed to the problem and the project of explanation, there are certain things that are going to be, for lack of a better way to put it, explained away. And one of those things is the freedom of the will, right? One of those things is the independent existence of the finite. And so with that view in mind, we can look at the particular form of argument that he gives for the unity of substance that I follow through in the book, right? It's not necessarily the most accepted way of reading, right, book 1 of the Ethics. There are many ways that people do this. But the idea that I like to follow through is that the principle of sufficient reason is essential for understanding that argument, or at the very least, if we're going to understand the way that Schelling read Spinoza, we have to follow through with this line of thought, because Schelling, following Jacoby in part, says that the principle of sufficient reason, or the idea that nothing can come out of nothing, is, as he says, right, the heart and soul of Spinozism. So basically, the idea is that in order to posit two discrete entities, right, you would have to be able to give a non-arbitrary reason for why there are two things.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to say that if you can't do that, then only one thing exists. And he constructs this argument through his definitions of attributes and modes as they relate to what's known as the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, right? So the idea of the principle of identity of indiscernibles is that for any two objects, in order to say that they're two things, there needs to be some differentiating criteria by which we would be able to identify one as object A and identify one as object B. And so Spinoza gives us two options for this. One is modes, but modes are necessarily dependent upon substance for their existence. So we wouldn't be able to use a particular mode as a way of distinguishing between two different substances. The other possibility is what he calls attributes. And he defines an attribute as what the intellect perceives of substance. So one way to think about this is an attribute is the way that we are able to think about substance, come to know substance. Right? And he says, we know two of them, they're thinking, and then they're being. So then this second option for distinguishing between two possible substances would be to say substance A has attribute 1 and 2, substance B has attribute 2 and 3. So they're related, but they're distinct. Right? But in the definition of attribute, Spinoza says that an attribute expresses the complete and not partial essence of substance. So if that's the case, then any substances with a shared attribute would be expressing the same complete essence. Right? So because you can't come up with a criteria for differentiating between substance A and substance B, you're forced into the conclusion that only one substance exists. And because of the position that he then takes on the fact that nothing can be the cause of its own finitude, we arrive with this very extreme metaphysical position that only one thing exists.
So is this where he gets hit because he believes in this kind of like panpsychism, like everything's just one thing? The other one, monism, right? Where is that how this works, right? Where it's just like, well, he's not really making any distinctions. I mean, he sort of is, but if it all becomes just a substance and it's just one substance, then how do we understand, I guess, the parts from the whole in that case, in his world?
Right. Yeah. So this is, another debated subject in Spinoza scholarship. One of the great things about Spinoza is the ethics came out, a very long time ago, and there's still
fighting about it, right?
on how to piece it all together. But I think that, one of the starting points, I think, for understanding how extreme this position of monism is, comes in some comments that he makes in some letters that he wrote. And he says to hold that things are really distinct is what he says, nonsense bordering on madness, right? So the idea is, on the one hand, and this really repulsed people. He said that, in a certain sense, your experience is incorrect, right? The way that we experience the world doesn't map onto, right, the way the world must be if we are able to provide certain explanations of it. So he says those tables, those chairs, those lamps, right, they're not real in a certain sense. They have a reality to them, but that reality cannot be found in their particularity. And then the second step that really confounds people is the way that this monism can be understood as either atheism, right, a denial of a transcendent God, or, right, what's known as acosmism, right, which would be a denial of the universe or the world or, the cosmos, saying that there is just God. So, one of the things that Pierre Bayle, one of the early critics of Spinoza, said, is this is the most monstrous hypothesis because it's so counter to our experience. Right? And what I wanted to do in the book, and what I think Schelling does, is he tries to really grapple with and understand the terror that's produced by this idea that only one thing can be said to truly exist. And again, this position was just so extremely counter to the way that we experience both ourselves and the world that, folks, here, I've got a great quote from Fichte here. This is one of my favorite things that someone has said about Spinoza. Right? He says, Spinoza could not have been in a state of conviction. He could only think his philosophy, not believe it, for it stood in the most immediate contradiction to the necessary conviction of everyday life, whereby he was bound to regard himself as free and independent. Right? So Fichte is saying, Spinoza was a person, and of course he experienced himself as free and independent. He could have only written this. There's no possible way he could have believed it. Right? It's just so absurd and so contrary to, the way that we experience it ourselves. But at the same point in time, one of the real strengths of Spinoza is the way that he generates this argument for monism. So it presents us with a real problem. Are we going to follow through with the consequences that we as rational beings are able to derive, right, from these kind of metaphysical problems? Or are we going to eschew the sort of very scary conclusions that arrive from that in order to, again, take ourselves to be, right, finite, independent, free beings?
Yeah, I think it's what is it? It's sort of like the dangerous idea of Spinoza, if you will, right? It's just kind of like, if you follow all the way through. I guess just on the example, right? So like the chair I'm sitting in, it exists in a way, right? So we put all these things together. We have a concept of what we want it to do. There's a functionality to it, but it's not really a chair, right? Like there's a bunch of parts to it, and there's things that we do, and there's, we don't think about these things, but it's a combination of parts that serve a function. We call that thing a chair, but it doesn't mean it actually is that. That's just what we claim it. And because we create it, doesn't mean that it exists independently, right? Like there's a way of saying like we can create things, or even if it's like things in the natural world, the things we call trees are trees. Okay? That doesn't make it so. That's just the thing we call it. There's a thing there, right? There's something there. But it doesn't make it, how we construct labels or how we understand things. You can do this, I think, even down to other kinds of concepts or ideas. 2 + 2 is 4. That's fine. But there's a whole system there that we design, right? And there's a way of organizing it. If you want to follow it all the way down, when you're talking about substances or things that exist, or, right, these attributes, these modes, I think you have to define what it is for that thing to be, because in a way, it doesn't. Would those things exist, or would those things be there if we didn't call it or name it those things? Sure, but I think it is, in terms of what it is or how we categorize it. I don't think it makes it more or less of an existence type of thing. So the attributes of things don't really, and then in that way, you could say, if you take the scientific argument of things, like there's X amount of materials in the universe, and after the Big Bang or whatever, they all sorted themselves out in some way, and here we are, right? So, right. Is that sort of kind of what he's saying about this whole like substance thing, where it's just like, well, it's just all one substance, like, or am I butchering it?
No, I think so. I think that what you've done is you've stepped into another series of debates in Spinoza around exactly what kind of monist he is. So there's a position that's known as priority monism, which holds that there is sort of one fundamental entity, and then there are non-fundamental entities, right? So the idea would be something like, and Jonathan Schaeffer advocates for this kind of position, and he says, well, there's the universe, right? That's the fundamental entity. And then we have these non-fundamental entities that are dependent upon, right, the universe, but they are relatively independent from it and relatively independent from each other, right? They exist, and then they have these properties that are, in a sense, added to them, right? But there's an argument against that, right? In the sense that one of the consequences of fully embracing the principle of sufficient reason is that there can be, as Della Rocca puts it, no illegitimate bifurcations in nature, right? Which means that any division, we have to be able to give a reason and an explanation for how that division came about, right? So when we're talking about the division between fundamental and non-fundamental entities, this problem arises. So the response is that, again, as counterintuitive as it may seem, the position that's able to avoid these logical problems that arise about part-whole relations and properties and substances, right? They arise because of the faulty assumption that more than one thing exists.
So I guess going back to this, I was going to ask it earlier, but I'm interested here now. It might make a lot of sense. This principle of sufficient reason. Why is it that this idea that we operate within a world of cause and effect? I mean, I think we certainly do, right? But couldn't we say that there are things in the universe and things on the planet and things about human nature and all the way down that are yet unknown or yet not known, or however you want to say it, and maybe possibly not everything works in cause and effect. So let me give an example. You're gonna hate me for this. So what about something like love? Like, that's an idea, right? And we all know what it is. And it's not just a feeling, and you can't reason your way into this or out of this, although some people try. And it's not just cause and effect. It's messy, it's complicated, but we know it exists. Like, it exists I don't know, it exists in the way like kind of like, maybe dark matter or dark energy exists. Like, it doesn't exist like, the cup here on my, or bottle here on my table, and it doesn't exist like the chair I'm sitting in, but it is a thing that we all know. Well, it's that. We know it when we feel it or we experience or whatever. I don't know if that's part of cause and effect. So that's one example. You could think of other examples, but you can use, I think you could use non-human examples with that. So are there things and are there elements that don't, or that would maybe be outside in the outside of the cause and effect and the principle of sufficient reason?
Yeah, so that's obviously a very complex
yes.
yeah, and sticky issue. But one of the problems that you inherit when you accept the principle of sufficient reason as a sort of global principle is that if there are to be exceptions, they can't be arbitrary exceptions, right? So you would have to be able to give an account or an explanation of why something would be exempt from this particular form of explanation. And interestingly, love does play an important role in both Schelling and Spinoza. They both talk about love is a kind of relationship to God or to substance. But at the same point in time, what Spinoza would say, or what the Spinoza that I present would say, is that it's kind of all or nothing here. Either, again, if the world is to be explicable, there has to be this necessary relationship between causes and effects that are perhaps not known right now, right? He's not saying that we know everything right now, but any causal relationship is in principle accessible to rational explanation. So again, it might be this sort of, we don't really know how love works, right, in the present moment or something like that. But if we accept the principle of sufficient reason, then we have to accept the fact that there's nothing in principle about love that can't be explained, even if we're not yet providing an explanation for it. And again, I think that these kind of examples are really important in disrupting the picture of this form of Spinozism, right? What if there are these sort of holes or gaps, right? And in the confrontation between Schelling and Spinoza when it comes to existence monism, I think that because of the way that Schelling thinks about the absolute, we do have to integrate these kind of gaps and these kind of pockets within the one thing that exists, which means that we're not arbitrarily limiting the principle of sufficient reason. We're just, let's say, specifying its applicability, right? Instead of it globally applying, we have to come up with this idea of specifications. I was trying to think of a good example for this the other day, and I think that something might be, like games and rules, right? Chess and checkers are both games, and they share certain aspects and elements of the rules, but there are also certain differentiating factors, right? So the rules of chess apply in a certain sphere, right? Whereas the rules of checkers also apply in a different sphere, and there's overlap there, but there's also difference. And I think that Schelling's more complex understanding of the one thing that exists, if we take him to be in existence monism, as I try to argue for, then we have to incorporate within it these kind of gaps and these kind of, these almost like an abyss, right? These little kernels.
I guess there's a deeper question here, which is, so I'll stay with love for a minute. So if love potentially has, let's say we keep, finding things out about love, and we realize that it has the potential or possibility of fitting within this principle of sufficient reason, but maybe not entirely or exclusively. Is it okay? But what if there are some things that are outside of that we still interact with on a daily basis that don't fit in with human reason or cognition? And we can't explain it, and other organisms can't explain it. Or maybe we haven't had the brain evolved enough to explain it, and some species, 10,000 years from now will figure it out, or I don't know. But isn't it? It's certainly, I don't think it disrupts the system. It's just saying, kind of like what you're saying, these kind of, pockets where there are some things that don't fit there. Why that is or why that isn't is, obviously a mystery. But isn't it okay if there are things that don't fit within human rationality? We can't explain everything. But we can't explain everything now, and we might not explain everything. Now, some people have said that about many things in physics, and here we are, right? We understand, things like, gravitational waves now and things like that. So so maybe feasibly or possibly, but yeah, isn't that possible?
Oh, it's absolutely possible, right? But I think that what we're outlining here are two extreme forms of a coin, right? So, on the one hand, let's follow through the consequences of the position that everything is explicable, right? What falls through there? How does it work, right? And on the other hand, we have this position of not necessarily nothing is explainable, right? Or nothing is explicable, but perhaps there are things that, are exceptions to this kind of universal rule. And I think that a lot of work has been done in the latter position, but I think that there's something fundamentally philosophical about the former position, right? And again, this kind of comes back to some of my broader philosophical commitments, again, to the idea of a particular understanding of rationalism. I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing that we as humans, right, these, mortal bags of flesh, we're really able to understand so much more than we can experience just as people. And so I think that what I want to do is sort of follow through with the consequences of that thought. Right? And again, a lot of what you're pointing to is why, folks were so uncomfortable with Spinoza because of all those what if questions. Another thing that Della Rocca explains when he's talking about what he calls Spinoza's naturalism. This is a very particular picture of naturalism, but it's the principle that everything plays by the same rules. Right? And again, that would be a necessary presupposition if we're going to be able to provide a universal explanation. And so again, you would have to think about what are non-arbitrary ways that we would be able to, right, demarcate what fits within that and what doesn't fit within that. And I guess I would just say that just as it's an assumption in a certain sense, right, that we have this capacity for universal explicability, it's also an assumption that we don't.
Yeah.
So, and I think that when we look at some of what Schelling is doing with Spinoza, we can see him tending towards this position that that Spinoza holds, right? Yeah. That there aren't these mysterious pockets in the world, right? That's what Jacoby would want to say. There are these mysteries, and the only way that we can, know them in scare quotes is through a kind of faith, through a kind of exemption from, right, a particular form of rational capture.
Yeah, it's also Jacoby always reminds me a little bit. I know things right before maybe there's some overlap with Kierkegaard and his whole leap of faith thing, and Kierkegaard was brilliant in many ways, but again, it's all the religious bullshit smuggled in. It feels like an unnecessary pivot. But all my Kierkegaardian friends get pissed off at me.
Yeah, I actually
like Kierkegaard, but I find it unnecessary.
I listened to the episode that you did with Richard Polt, and your line about you get frustrated with Kierkegaard because kind of smuggles the Jesus thing in the back door, as you put it. I don't really get into the later philosophical work of Schelling. But he lets Jesus right in through the front door.
Oh,
right?
boy.
He becomes just a very religious thinker in one sense. But I think that, as I was talking about earlier, he's got this peculiar position towards revelation, which is that, again, revelation can be explained. We can give an explanation for the revelation of God in Christ and then the death and resurrection of Christ. And there is work on the role that faith plays at that point. But I still see Schelling carrying through this Spinozistic insight that we can continue to give an explanation for that. And again, I guess I should just specify really quickly that the kind of explanations that Schelling wants to give are not dependent on the form of mechanistic causal relationality that Spinoza wants to focus on. And this comes back to some of the questions you were asking about the philosophy of nature, right? So one of the things that Schelling is really critical of when it comes to Spinoza's picture of nature is the idea that it falls into sort of modern Enlightenment mechanistic worldview. And Schelling wants to say that, yeah, I mean, mechanism exists in nature, but he's going to say that organism or dynamism is necessarily prior to that.
Okay, well, let's come back to that. Let's come back to that. I'll say my thoughts about some of that, why I have a strong reaction to it. I know it's part of it is some of my seminary days, but then there's another part of it as well. Okay, so I do want to again touch on the philosophy of nature, but just real quick before that, two other pieces here. So just briefly, just talk about Kant's synthetic judgments. I know it's a little in the weeds here. Just explain that, but specifically where that fits in with how Schelling agrees with that, and in terms of the absolute. So then you can kind of explain what the absolute is and where he's fitting, because he's pulling. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you can maybe you could, but I don't know if you could understand how Schelling's looking at the absolute without understanding maybe Kant's synthetic agreements, or it would be very helpful to understand. So that's the kind of link there.
Yeah. So I think that where I address this in the book comes in chapter 2, which is again about this essay, The Philosophical Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism. And one of the things that he does there is he counterposes a certain form of Kantianism with his reading of Spinoza as this dogmatist who encapsulates or annihilates the subjective side in the objective, right? So Schelling is going to acknowledge the really important emphasis and insight that Kant has into the synthetic capacity of judgment, right? But in the critique, when Kant is talking about this kind of stuff, he's talking about the ways that our minds, right, that we are able to think metaphysics. We're able to do metaphysics through thinking. So then, in part with reference to Spinoza, what Schelling wants to do is then ask the further question of, so if synthetic a priori judgments are possible, right, what are the preconditions of the world such that those are possible as well, right? Mm-hmm. So a sort of somewhat simple way of formulating this would be, in addition to the subjective syntheses that make experience and metaphysics possible, there's a series of objective syntheses that, in a certain sense, right, give rise to those different mental abilities or mental structures, right? This comes back to our discussion about the emergent relation between mindedness and nature. So in a certain sense, what he's going to do is broaden the notion of synthesis into this sort of larger picture of dynamic, self-relating activity. And it's with that, I think, that he begins to formulate what the role of the absolute is going to be in uniting these two, right, seemingly opposed notions of synthesis. So yeah, that's kind of where, at least in the book, how I take up that. There's plenty of other work that really focuses on the way that Schelling takes up these issues directly from Kant, and how he tries to solve certain problems that are created in the first critique. But what I was really interested in doing was using that to demonstrate the fact that in order to understand what Schelling is doing there, we need to have this sort of larger context, right? It's not just an epistemological question for Schelling. It's not just a question about knowledge. It's a question about what we might call the ontology of knowability. So that's kind of a first pass on that.
How here then is there's this synthesis part that you're kind of illuminating here, and how does that? There's a movement away from Kant's critical philosophy and then embracing Fichte's idealism. You talk about that also, I think, in the same chapter. Yeah, there's there's a type of my feeling of Schelling. I'll be very honest that I've read some of his stuff and then reading about him. He's somebody I have a really hard time kind of like not put in a box, but I'm like what's his thing? Like I'm trying to figure it out, and I slowly start to kind of get it as reading your book and other stuff, and then obviously his own works, but. It does seem like he's trying to find this kind of balance here, but again, as he moves from Kant and the critical philosophy, and then he kind of goes to Fichte's idealism. How do you see that movement?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things you just very nicely did is show how difficult it is to be a Schelling expert. Like, I really wouldn't even begin to call myself an expert in Schelling's philosophy, right? I found a lot of very interesting utility there, but he was a just prolific writer, and on so many different topics. And like you said, it is very hard to put him into these various boxes.
Mm-hmm. He's elusive. He doesn't fit. He's got his tentacles in a lot of things. And he has a very interesting kind of way. I mean, the writing is, obviously a little antiquated of sorts, but he just has a very interesting way of, I don't know. Again, just personality wise, he didn't seem like he had like a huge personality, right? Like this, like, let me develop this whole system and I'm going to just tell everybody, like, Hegel definitely had like his system, and Kant had a system, and, but he seems, I don't know. It just, the impressions I get is that there's a lot of ways of trying to find balance, but then trying to see how everything kind of coalesces together. And you can see him trying to bridge things and not quite figuring it out. That's why I'm interested. I'll get to it, but the later stuff with all the Jesus in your face kind of thing. So,
but yeah, just real quick though, to come back to your question in terms of the movement towards what Fichte was doing, there was a shared attitude amongst these sort of early post-Kantians that one of the things that was really lacking from the critical project was a more, let's say, systematic relationship between the division that Kant makes between theoretical and practical philosophy. And so in the book, I try to show that this was even a concern for Jacoby about the ways in which the practical has to ground the theoretical. And this is, a major theme in Fichte about the practical positing of the I, and how when we focus on this activity, we're able to, let's say, better resolve some of the issues in Kant's, right, genesis of the categories and all of this kind of stuff. And so Schelling picks up on that and this idea of the primacy of the practical. But in doing so, one of the things that he wants to do is, again, in a certain sense, generalize that, right? There's something practical for Schelling about nature. And what I mean by that is that nature itself is able to do this kind of positing and self-determining, right? And this is what leads to ultimately his break with Fichte, right? Because there's this series of letters that they exchanged, and they come to loggerheads on the issue of the relationship between nature and transcendental philosophy. Fichte, right, posits that transcendental philosophy is primary, and nature is, in a certain sense, only a shadow of the activity of theoretical philosophy or transcendental philosophy. Whereas what Schelling wants to say is that, Fichte, without justification, restricts that kind of self-relating, self-positing activity, again, to the side of the subject, right? So for Schelling, one of the most important things is that there's an activity that's proper to nature itself. And this, it's interesting because this also links back to the criticism of Spinoza, and the idea that, sure, for Spinoza, there is a certain type of activity, right, in substance or in nature, but that this activity is posited as reductively mechanistic. So he's going to draw certain aspects from practical philosophy and Schelling's doctrine, but then, again, try to expand this out. This is why Schelling is a thinker of the absolute, because he always wants to understand these kind of things in this very complex nexus of relation and differentiation. Right? So, and again, to bring it back to the very beginning of the book, this is why I try to focus on that grapheme of the hyphen.
Yeah.
Because it's a simultaneous binding and separating. And so yeah, that's kind of my pictograph for
Yeah. So as we've been alluding to here for a little bit, one of the things that's super, I guess, unique, I don't want to say unique, but yeah, I guess distinct. I mean, you don't hear about it a lot, or at least in the way he did it, was Schelling's idea or his concept of his philosophy of nature. So I've read a little bit on this, but you can go as full blown as you want on it. What was the whole of nature? How is it equivalent to the ever becoming? And what does he mean by becoming? And then also the how did he view the subject object and his view of concept of nature? So just kind of give us kind of the broad brushstrokes first, and then you can get down to the details as much as you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I had mentioned is how there was really this renewed interest in Schelling's philosophy of nature that was generated largely by Ian Grant's book. Again, the title is Philosophies of Nature after Schelling. And Schelling was interested in the empirical science of his day, right? He was very interested in chemistry, medicine, all of this kind of stuff. And one of the things that he wanted to do was understand the role that a certain type of philosophical thinking plays in how we construct nature. And the sort of next step that he takes there is trying to understand that philosophical thinking of nature or about nature, right, as embedded within the dynamic of nature itself. So, he's going to say that we have to construct an understanding of nature. And part of the reason for this is because our experience of nature sort of contradicts certain elements of what nature must be if we are to understand nature as this kind of, as you put it, active or ever becoming aspect, right? So he's going to say that we encounter the products of nature, right? We encounter particular organisms, whatever it is, but that these organisms and that these natural objects that we encounter, they're only a presentation of the one side of nature as self-stagnating, right? So in its, sort of constant dynamic self-relation, nature tries to, let's say, distinguish itself from its activity by positing itself in these products, right? And I take a slightly sort of larger view on this in the book, and I try to argue that this self-relating dynamic of nature is very similar to a discussion that he had regarding the notion of spirit, just slightly prior to beginning these sort of nature philosophical works. And what he says there is that in order to know itself as infinite productivity, one of the things that spirit has to do is produce itself as products, right? Because it's not just a purely active thing, right? As you put it, we might say it's not a purely subjective positing. One of the things that it's capable of doing is positing itself as an object. And then this third step, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, why it has to do that. Why does it have to do that? Is it we find that it does, or it should, or is it a feature that it has to kind of manifest in nature or in an external way?
So I guess the way that I would phrase it is to come to know itself as producing.
Mm-hmm.
It must produce a product, right? There must be a product that comes out of that. And then what happens is spirit relates to its product in such a way that it is then able to reveal to itself its own producing activity.
Like a mirror.
Yeah, in a certain sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what happens in the philosophy of nature is that this sort of similar process is repeated. And again, what he wants to do is show us how, and there's something Spinozist about this, right? Show us how our experience of nature presupposes a form of nature as active producing that we don't experience directly in the products of nature. So this is what has to be a priori constructed by the philosopher, right? This underlying dynamic process that we never actually encounter in experience, right? Insofar as we encounter, right, the products of nature. We never go outside and see nature itself, right? Because again, nature itself is this dynamic, productive, right, set of forces.
Say that that one part again about how this maps onto the philosophy of nature, and how kind of how you say it's a kind of like a Spinozism kind of thing. How does that function again? Or how does it work?
Yeah, so if we think about it in terms of what kind of understanding of nature would we come to if we only took into account the products of nature?
So
right?
If I go outside and I just look at the rock, I just look at this one tree.
Right.
Uh-huh.
You're going to get a picture of nature as something static, right? You're going to get a picture of nature as something that has these that is reducible to the mechanistic interrelations of discrete objects, right? And one of the things that Schelling is doing, and again, as a transcendental philosopher, he's trying to ask, what is the condition of possibility for the existence of those objects, right? Okay. And again, that condition of possibility has to be this dynamic process of, right, as he's going to say, combining and decombining of particular forms. And once again, right, that actual process of the ever becoming whole of nature is not something that's ever given an experience. It has to be constructed philosophically. And this again demonstrates the necessary relationship that he holds between transcendental philosophy and the philosophy of nature.
So that, on that part, the constructing piece, that's what I'm stuck on. So if I go and I take a walk beside a river or whatever on a path, and I'm in nature, let's say, because I'm not seeing all of nature in one moment, I'm having to construct what the other things I'm not seeing are in, so that way I can say, well, this is nature. Or so I guess the whole thing is I want to make sure I get this right. He's not saying you have to have the whole gestalt to then know what nature is, that you're just seeing a part of it. He's not saying that, is he? Right? What's the distinction here about the construction of it? Is I guess what I'm trying to find.
Yeah, let me try to think of another way to explain this. So, you brought up the idea of the river.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Think about the products of nature. And I'm pretty sure he actually directly makes this comparison in the first outline for the system of the philosophy of nature, where he talks about, a river and then the little eddies, right? All the different dynamics and currents that are going to arise there. Right. And our experience of natural products is this experience of this temporarily self-stagnation of nature, right? And again, so that whole dynamic process is not something that you're going to capture, right, when you just go outside. You have to bring philosophy to it in order to, and again, the conditions by which natural products are possible. Because if we begin with just the products, we're not able to give an account of, right, how they come to be, or, the transition from chemistry to mechanism to organism and all of these kind of things.
Okay.
Does that kind of clear it up a little bit?
Yeah. I think that does. So it basically is because, if I'm going outside and I see a river and I have to understand the components or the products of it, whether I'm thinking about it consciously or not, to understand, to know, like, okay, this is a river. So I'm bringing something to it in my understanding, that whole construction thing. It's not like I come to it as a novel experience, right? There's nothing in nature. There are things in nature that we have not experienced that we come to that is novel, but just in the general sense, I know what a river is, right? right. And I have a construct of what that is. So it's that part of I'm bringing it there. And then is it because of because I'm only seeing? Okay, let me give another example. I'll give a more concrete example. I live very close to the Potomac River. Which, for reference, is the main river that divides, Maryland and Virginia by Washington, D.C. And it actually flows through Washington, D.C., or right next to it. And it's really big. So at any other point, two people could be experiencing the same river just at two different points. And you have to understand, well, I guess you don't have to, but you're knowing that the point that you're experiencing the river is not the totality of it. And you're bringing with it the concept of, at some place, this has a starting point. And at some place, this flows into, what does it flow into? The Chesapeake, the Atlantic, whatever. The point is that whatever it flows into. And there's a markation of, where one ends and one begins or whatever. But you have a concept of, like, rivers, how they work, streams, currents. If you really want to get specific, depth, and if you understand things about certain aspects of biology or whatever, molecules and things like that. But his point is that we're bringing all of that into nature in order to complete the whole gestalt of what it is to be a river. So instead of just the part that we're seeing in that moment, or, is it just the whole concept of, like, you could sail down the whole river, but you're still bringing in things about it to just know the whole aspect of it?
I think I might be a little bit confused about the example, but I guess one of the things that I would emphasize is that somewhat central to the nature of philosophy is that nature brings this to itself, right? And we are, when we think about nature, right, again, is the relationship between products and then the processes by which those products, right, come to be,
right?
That itself is also a form of positing processes and products.
Okay.
So there's not this kind of hard distinction between the subjective and the objective going on here, right? There's an objective and real genesis of, right, again, our subjective experiences, as you put it, what we bring to the river, right? That is not something unnatural. It kind of relates to this idea that, humans are this bizarre thing that is of nature and is able to come to understand nature, and in very specific ways become unnatural. Right.
Yes.
And so again, the bigger picture, right, the sort of headline we could give on it is, what Schelling is interested in is processes over products, right? So instead of saying that we have beings, and then once we have beings, we account for becomings, that there's a primacy to becoming itself, right? Being, or being in nature is, as he says, a temporary stagnation or self-retardation of that becoming. Because in order to really become, right, if nature is to be, able to, for lack of a better way to put it, be all that it can be, right, it has to be able to become a product. Because otherwise there's something, right, excluded from the dynamic of nature.
So it sounds like this. What is the relationship between, in terms of nature, what is the relationship between the products or the features and then the processes? Is that relationship that's going on there? Right.
And it's not like a dichotomous or binary relationship.
There's a fluidity to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's going to say that all natural products are really only temporary, right? The eddies are going to flow back into the river in that larger sense.
Okay.
So,
I get it now.
Right. And once he begins to understand nature in this way, this is how he's able to begin to connect it to the sort of Fichtean idealist project of dynamic, self-relating production of intelligibility at the same time. So
yeah, I remember when I talked to Gabe Gottlieb, he mentioned the I or the self or whatever Fichte was going on about. So yeah, so kind of connect those two, right? So how understanding nature in this way, how does it relate back to then the interaction or the reciprocal ways in which it operates with either the self or that I that Fichte was explaining?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Schelling wrote this essay, I believe it was 1801. It's abbreviated as On the True Concept. I'm blanking right now of the entire full title because he sometimes liked to do that German idealist thing of releasing books with incredibly long titles.
Right.
But in that essay, he says, there's an I of transcendental philosophy and there's an I of nature. And for me, the I of nature is primary. So again, you can see what he's trying to do there is, we could say, provide a certain type of realist ground or realist grounding for the I of transcendental philosophy. Because, there's this idea that, earlier we talked about how transcendental philosophy and nature philosophy sort of move in opposite directions in an attempt to arrive at each other. And what he's doing in that essay is he's saying that because Fichte begins with the I of transcendental philosophy and this subjective I, right, that he's not able to arrive then at nature. He cuts himself off from that, right?
Yeah, is there like an obfuscation of sorts that's happening because of the focus on the I? He can't get to the I of nature?
Yeah, so, for Fichte, one of the, really important secondary concepts is not just the I, but what he calls the not I. So the I determines itself by positing a not I and differentiating itself from that. The not I is always passive in relationship to the I, right? It's the I that does the determining, and it's the I that's, understands itself through that determination, right? The not I is a passivity. And so when talking about something like nature, right, the argument goes that for Fichte, because nature is the not I, it's always passive, right? So, we can maybe think about the claim about the I of nature in that way, right? He's not talking about this kind of transcendental I think that must accompany all my representations, as Kant is saying, but he's thinking about it more in terms of the activity that we attribute to I-hood.
But Schelling is saying that it's different. He's saying that it's not passive, or he's agreeing with Fichte in that way?
he's saying that if we associate nature, or if we reduce nature to the not I, then all of nature becomes passive.
Okay.
So there has to be this kind of I of nature that also is involved in this active process of creation, determination, positing, differentiation, unification, right? All of these different dynamics that have to be there if we are going to provide some kind of system of philosophy that is taking transcendental philosophy seriously, but also taking, right, the natural sciences seriously.
So then you would essentially have, see if I get this right, that you would have the I and the not I for the human, for the being, and you would have, according to Schelling, a potential I and not I of nature as well, both having an active passive component to it, and then there would be interactions between any of those scenarios.
Yeah, I think that the way that I would just slightly reframe it is, in nature, instead of I and not I, it's process and product.
Oh, okay. So, okay, yeah, got it. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
And he frames it in this way. For me, the I of nature is primary. The I of transcendental philosophy is secondary. But again, he's, and he kind of wavers on this. So there's this text he wrote called On the World Soul that maybe is a little bit more sort of panpsychist, but right, he wants to, as I keep saying, right, maintain the similarity and the difference between transcendental philosophy and natural philosophy. Right? He's not in any way a kind of reductive naturalist who's going to say that the I that transcendental philosophers talk about is completely and fully explicable from the perspective of the philosophy of nature. Right? So again, there is this element of understanding that we have to bring to nature if we are going to get to that level where we're able to notice almost, not the superficiality of the products of nature, but the fact that those are a sort of temporary moment. Right. So again, nature itself is not the trees that you see in the woods or the squirrels that you see running around or something like that. Right. Nature as such is this longer, larger, almost even historical process by which these things emerge and arise and then disappear. Right?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. It's really interesting. So let's just jump forward in time for a bit. If you don't want to think about this, that's fine. So where does this fit, I guess, with Heidegger's ideas of worldhood and being in the world and many of those things? Now, again, right, I can't talk about German philosophy and not talk about Heidegger. I mean, I got to bring him up somewhere. We've gone a couple hours. I got to bring him up somewhere. So I think it's important, though, because Heidegger's ideas about worldhood is different. So just for context, my understanding is that Heidegger was doing more of a phenomenological and an ontological approach. So everything was through Dasein, right? This type of being there, this existence. So he has a type of lens there, which it sounds like Schelling was not doing necessarily. So I guess, yeah, just in a quasi-comparative way, how do we understand, everything you just explained about products and processes and understanding about nature, how would that fit or not fit, I guess, with something like Heidegger's ideas of the environment and worldhood?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm going to have to disappoint you a little bit on this one. I'm really, I had an interest in Heidegger earlier on, but sort of faded into the background to the point where over a series of moves, I no longer have my Heidegger books on my shelf, which is unfortunate.
He's been demoted. You've put him on the bench.
I will retrieve them at some time. But so when it comes particularly to the question of world and worldhood, I'm not really going to be able to unpack that too much in relationship to Schelling. I think that part of it we can understand in relationship to Kant, and his idea of the world as a regulative ideal of reason, right? The world is a kind of horizon of intelligibility for our experiences of the world, and when we try to systematically construct those experiences. So that's the sort of idealist connection that I see there. But I would mention, in terms of Schelling and Heidegger, I know you're a fan of the Nietzsche lectures.
Yeah.
And for Heidegger, Schelling was sort of the penultimate figure in the history of the determination of being, right? Because in the Freedom Essay and then in the Ages of the World, he has this claim about how will is primal being, right? And at the beginning of the 1811 Ages of the World project, he talks about this originary will that wills nothing. So this is, in a certain sense, for Heidegger, the second to last stop on the train before we get to the determination of being as will to power. So there's a very important connection running through that way. But I don't want to go too far out on a limb.
Sure. No, it's interesting.
Out of the tree by Heideggerians when it comes to talking about worldhood and whatnot.
That's totally fair. There was recently, I guess it was a year ago now, a published. I always compare it to some of these philosophers that getting their stuff published into English. It's like the posthumous rap albums that come out after someone's been dead. It's like, oh, we got another album dropping, right? So there was a series of lectures Heidegger did on German idealism. It came out last year. And Schelling is mentioned, but I haven't read it or thought about it since, but I will go back and read it after this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Heidegger did two very important lectures on Schelling, at least, right? And one is a specific exposition of the philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom. And in there, he begins by looking at this conflict that emerges between, on the one hand, system, and on the other hand, freedom. And this was a very explicitly stated problem that the post-Kantian idealists were trying to work through. And then in the second series of lectures on the metaphysics of German idealism, he really wants to be able to make the argument that German idealism, in a certain sense, completes itself, right, with Schelling. And I'm never quite sure what to make of the claim of completes itself. I'm never quite sure what that even means. But they also might be of interest to you because he discusses Kierkegaard at length in the metaphysics of German idealism.
Yeah. Kierkegaard is also mentioned. I think I'd have to pull it. I don't remember where. There's a handful of people that are mentioned. It's interesting their lectures, so it's not like a book or anything, but it's interesting to see kind of his thoughts and where he was with engaging with some of these other figures on these things. So so there's a shift for Schelling. So back to Schelling. So that there's a shift from philosophy of nature to a philosophy of identity. And him and Spinoza, where does he, I guess, fall with Spinoza in here? You talk about it in the book about this kind of shift that happens. So just maybe chat about that.
Yeah. So this is, in my opinion, this is one of the greatest sort of hermeneutic difficulties in trying to understand what Schelling's up to. Right? When we take a sort of longer view of the development of the project. Some of his most important texts on the philosophy of nature are sort of published right in 1799. And then he has the Ideas for the Philosophy of Nature, which is published a little bit before that, and then revised later, but around 1801, right? So in 1800, he writes this book called The System of Transcendental Idealism. And what he does there is he really tries to lay out his understanding from the perspective of transcendental philosophy, the process of consciousness, right, going from a sort of unconscious element and then rising to self-consciousness, right? So there's a certain sense in which this is a kind of precursor to the phenomenology of spirit, that's trying to understand consciousness's experience of itself and the world that consciousness produces when it's experiencing itself, right, as producing. But then in 1801, he puts out this piece called The Presentation of My System of Philosophy, and the presentation. And in there, he begins this period of what's known as the identity philosophy. And he begins that text with this really sort of, I don't know, cryptic, I don't want to say disingenuous, but he says, none of my readers should think that I've altered my system of philosophy. But when you read the identity philosophy, it's really hard not to feel like there are some serious changes that are being made. And then the second major point that comes up in the kind of preface to that work is he says, I've taken Spinoza as my model for this work because it most closely mirrors his work in both its form and content. And so there's a sense in which, or at least this is how I read it, he's turning to that element of Spinoza that's not just about the sort of realism or dogmatism, as he had talked about in the philosophical letters on dogmatism and criticism, but what he's trying to get into is how can we understand the unity, again, between transcendental philosophy and the philosophy of nature. And in order to do this, he begins with this notion of identity, right, which he just marks as A equals A, which is supposed to, right, importantly, it distinguishes itself from the Fichtean model of I equals I, right, that sort of unity, that simple unity of the I. And he's trying to, in a certain sense, make this more objective. So it's not on the side of the subject through which the philosophy of nature and transcendental philosophy are reconciled into a larger unity. But it's through what he's eventually going to call, right, the absolute itself. So, and in this work and in several of the other texts from the identity philosophy, as he concludes them, he deduces nature, right, from these kind of fundamental first principles. So he doesn't, leave his interest in nature philosophy aside when he turns to the identity philosophy. But the way I read it is what he draws from Spinoza in that moment begins to change.
And so, and there, this is where he starts to critique his realism ideas, yeah? Just in the same way as he was critiquing Fichte's idealism? Or is that later?
So, I think that the reciprocal need of realism and idealism is pretty consistent throughout Schelling's writings.
Okay.
So I wouldn't necessarily say he's critiquing his own realism. It's not abundantly clear that the text is even a self-critique. He really sets it out as, trying to, again, provide the sort of larger context in which these earlier writings would make sense. But in doing that, I think he develops a notion of the absolute that is not explicitly stated in this way in some of the earlier texts, right? If we were going to use some sort of Hegelian terminology, there's a sense in which the identity philosophy marks a move from the more subjective idealism of the system of transcendental idealism in 1800 to a more objective form of idealism, right? And insofar as it's an objective form of idealism, it also has to incorporate with it, or at least be open to, a kind of realism. Right? And understanding what that realism is there is pretty difficult. And another thing that he starts to do there is talk about how realism and idealism, and then the real and the ideal by extension, are somewhat like Spinoza's attributes of thinking and being. And he makes this association pretty explicit. But then, as I argue in the book, as he moves throughout this identity philosophy period, which, again, begins around 1801 continues through 1804 up to 1806. It's somewhat debated on where the true end of the identity philosophy is. But in the book, I try to argue that in order to sort of break free from some of the issues that he sees in Spinoza, particularly his claim that Spinozism is lifeless, that he has to really call into question the idea that real and ideal are attributes that exist in a parallel fashion to the absolute or to identity itself, right? Because I guess just to sort of get to the punchline of part of what the book does is, a lot of scholarship is focused on the way that Schelling inherits Spinoza's monism, right? And this is, very apparent that he finds inspiration in the monism. He expresses it differently at various points in time, right? And I think it's a 1795 letter, but I might be getting the date wrong on that. To Hegel, right, he says, I've become a Spinozist. For him, right, the world is everything. For me, it's the I. So there's that Spinozism there. But what he then does is he locates a kind of irreducible duality or dualism within Spinoza when it comes to the emergence of the real and the ideal orders from, right, the monism or the unity of the absolute itself. And so the question then, right, he's going to say, that Spinoza is unable to provide a transition from the unity of substance to the duality of the attributes. And he's also going to say, shoot, I said A and then forgot B. But yeah, so this is where those problems kind of begin to emerge. Oh, right, B. So B then comes back to the problem of life. Right. So part of the setup for the book is it's really well known, right? The philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom are perhaps Schelling's most read, right, and most influential text. And in there, he makes this clear claim that Spinozism is lifeless. Right? And he says it's lifeless because it reduces, the parts of God to objects, basically, or thinks of God as consisting of parts, or nature is consisting of parts.
Right.
But the point that I try to make in the book is that it can actually, the lifelessness of Spinozism can be traced back to this problem of the relationship between unity and duality, and the idea of duality being able to emerge from some kind of prior and what he calls unacquired unity. So this is where, and I think that in the identity philosophy, the sort of, why it's almost so startling to begin reading that text is the fact that, he just completely shifts his perspective. He begins looking at the relationship between transcendental philosophy and nature philosophy from what we would call perhaps the perspective of the absolute itself. So. Yeah, and so when I first took a course on Schelling, we did the nature philosophical works, and then the next week we were reading the presentation. I remember just the whiplash. How did we get here? What are we doing?
Right.
So trying to disambiguate the relationship of that text to the nature philosophy is incredibly complex, and there are varying positions on this. Those that embrace the sort of naturalist continuity thesis are going to maintain that he's still doing nature philosophy there. And I think that that's partially correct. But I think he's doing nature philosophy in a different way, right? He's showing how the philosophy of nature really is a particularization or regionalization of this larger dynamic of the absolute that then provides the unity that he needs in order to, try to make this claim that he's reconciled his system.
I was going to say, it sounds like a reconciliation of sorts. What listeners can't see this, but I've drawn this here. So is it sort of like this, where he has the absolute at top, And then outside of the absolute comes the idealism and the realism, right? So you kind of say, the absolute is up here, and then just kind of like these two, it's like two handles of an umbrella, if you will, that they're just coming out from that. They're coming out from the kind of overarching idea of the absolute. Is that what he's trying to do with both of those? So going back to your beginning point of the hyphenated idealism, realism, but he's putting it subsumed under the absolute. Is that somewhat like that?
Yeah. So I think the way I would explain it, right, this is one of the most like difficult parts of the project to kind of put into words, right? Because, one of the shared positions about this is that there's something about the absolute that is, resistant to discursive understanding and discursive capture. But yeah, you're absolutely right to bring it back to the claim I made about the hyphen earlier, and this idea of working from the middle out. Right? The ideal and real are both in a certain sense there when we begin in the absolute. And one of the things, again, that I try to argue for in the book is that, in your picture, you have absolute, and then on the one hand, you have real, and on the other hand, you have ideal. I think that when you look at his texts, and specifically as he moves out of the identity philosophy and towards some of these, what some people call the middle philosophical projects, you see that division is never that clean, right? There's always this kind of mutual interpenetrating dynamic of the ideal within the real and the real within the ideal, and these kind of things, which is, why, the picture that he paints is pretty, for lack of a better way to put it, disruptive to the nice kind of clean philosophical understanding that we oftentimes try to bring to the history of philosophy, right? Saying, his realism is this, and this is his idealism, or, he's best read as a, whatever, liberal naturalist, whatever kind of box you try to put him in. And I think that in the identity philosophy in particular, we begin to see how difficult it is to do that, right? And, Schelling had the foresight to tell us that, right?
Yeah.
That some people might want to classify it this way. Some people might want to classify it this way. Some might say it's a third thing. But again, all you need to know is that I haven't changed my system. And the reader is like, well, I don't know. It kind of seems like you did. So,
right. This might just be a footnote. You mentioned it. I was just curious about it because I hadn't heard of it. So if you don't want to talk at length about it, that's fine. This work done by Hogan and Porkrick on blotobjectivism, which is, you say, I think it's a quote, but it's an ontological analysis of spatio-temporal complexity that eschews genuine parts, in favor of spatio-temporal local manners of instantiation. So what's that? And like, how does that connect with Spinoza and Schelling, and the idea I think was on monism?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons why I brought that in was to try to push back against any claim that existence monism is an antiquated philosophical position. And they co-authored a great book called Austere Realism that tries to claim a certain form of existence monism and say that one thing exists. While at the same point in time outlining what they call a contextual semantics of indirect reference, in order to understand the ways that when we talk about the world, we talk about it in terms of having discrete parts and discrete objects. But the claim then is that it's an unfounded assumption that those discrete objects that we're talking about actually exist. I think that, this connects back to some of the stuff in Spinoza, and particularly the way I read the relationship of modes to substance in Spinoza. But I was really attracted to this idea of the blobject, right? Because I think that one of the things that they do with that is they undermine any assumption, again, that objects are passive. So the blobject is able to exemplify just a massive amount of right, local variability, while at the same point in time remaining one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really nice model for trying to think about, the relationship between identity and monism, and then, right, the let's say criticism that any kind of monism relies upon a simple identity. I guess one of the kind of connections I could draw here is, I'm sure you're familiar with, the line in the Phenomenology of Spirit's preface about the problem of the night in which all cows are black. Right? This was a real sticking point for Schelling. He was not happy about this, so on and so forth. But I think that one of the things that appealing to the blobject is supposed to do is show that the assumption that in the absolute or in a certain form of identity, that it is a night in which all cows are black, right? Because the night in which all cows are black lacks that local
distinction,
complexity and variability, right? And there's something sort of, let's say, introductory about that part of the work. It's something that I really want to begin to expand on, and begin using some more of the, let's say, linguistic conventions of that kind of a certain type of analytic philosophy in order to better capture what's really going on here. Because a lot of the book is, in a certain sense, through Schelling's voice and using Schelling's words. And I think that in order to really demonstrate the contemporaneity of what Schelling's doing there, it has to be, for lack of a better way to put it, updated. And I see that as one very fruitful avenue for doing so. There's some real issues with the comparison there, because one of the ways that austere realism gets to its claim about the blobject is through criticism of what they call ontological vagueness. Right? And they try to say that there can be no such thing as vague objects. And for Schelling, in the identity philosophy, one of the things he talks about is the difference between qualitative identity and quantitative differentiation. Right? So the absolute is qualitatively identical to itself, right? But differentiation happens in terms of quantities, right? So there are different, let's say, to use almost Deleuzian language, right? There are these various intensities of the qualitative identity that from those, and at least in my reading, we get these things that we experience as determinate particulars, right? But it would seem as if relying on this sort of quantitative fluctuation, we might run into the problem of articulating a kind of ontological vagueness. And the response that I would want to formulate is something like, the qualitative identity of the absolute is not vague, right? But there is quantitative variation that is then able to maybe begin accounting for some of that stuff. But like I said, these are some debates in analytic philosophy that I'm very interested in sort of putting my toe into the water of, because I think that there's a real value in this kind of work in terms of, developing a shared vocabulary, really trying to capture, again, like your question, what is the absolute? I've been reading this stuff for, 10 years now or whatever, and it's still, it's very difficult to just say in plain and common language what it would be. But again, I really like this idea of using the blobject as a model. That updating it through some of the, what I would call like almost darker elements of Schelling's account of emergence, to, sometimes analytic philosophy can be too happy.
Yes, or too happy, or too logical, too technical. And so, you got to go to the continental folks and just get all the really dark, fucked up parts of humanity. Right. Okay. So let me ask you, let's go back to Kant for a little bit. In the book, in the last third of the book, you talk about his antinomies. How do you say this?
Antinomies.
Antinomies, yeah. Pure reason and the problem of emergence, as you were just mentioning. So, just what are those for, and then we can talk about how Schelling follows Kant's kind of system of reason because of the whole internal external thing or whatever. So yeah, just go over the four antinomies.
Yeah, so this is a pretty important part of the book. One of the ways that I orient my scholarship around post-Kantian philosophy is specifically through relation to the transcendental dialectic, which is the part of the critique of pure reason in which, we find the antinomies. So basically what Kant is trying to do in that section is, show how reason's analysis of its own operation undermines the fundamental categories that he sees of rationalist philosophy, right? So in the paralogisms, he talks about how he provides a criticism of Descartes, right? The notion of the soul. In the antinomies, he looks at the problem of the world and rational cosmology. And then finally, he looks at the problem of rational theology, where he comes to his conclusion about, being isn't a first order predicate. So the ontological argument for God's existence must fail. And in the antinomies section, there are four distinct antinomies. The two he refers to as the mathematical antinomies. The second two, so the third and fourth, he refers to as the dynamical antinomies. The first antinomy engages with the problem of the size and age of the world, right? So one of the ways that we can think about this is, does the world have a beginning in time, and is it limited in space? And what he does, and I won't get into too much of the technicalities, but he's kind of trying to show the inconsistencies that are produced by a certain way of using the principle of sufficient reason, right? He says the constitutive aspect of the principle of sufficient reason generates these conflicts that can't be resolved, right? Because an antinomy, what it is it's two logically valid and sound arguments that have absolutely opposed conclusions.
Right.
So the question is, how can both be true? Right. So he first looks at the size and age of the world. Then he engages basically with atomism, right? What is the smallest possible part? And then he gets to the relationship between basically what we would call nature and freedom, right? The idea of nature as a series of necessarily causally connected mechanistic events on the one hand, and then freedom as an act that is not preceded by any cause. And so he's going to show there how it's both necessary and impossible. And then finally, he looks at the problem of the absolute. And he again kind of comes to this conclusion that, there's a necessity to it, but at the same point in time, from the perspective of rationalist cosmology, it's also impossible. So the way that I sort of set that up then is I almost see the antinomies like a gauntlet, right? Okay. So if you accept some of the findings of the critique of pure reason, you're going to be presented with this issue, right? Because one of the things that he says is that these antinomies are in part produced when we assume that space and time are objectively real, as opposed to just a priori forms of intuition. And so by looking at the post-Kantians in relationship to that problem, we can sort of see if and how they pass a kind of test, right? How do they move their way through these necessary impossibilities? And one of the conclusions that Kant comes to when he's talking about the size and age of the world is he says that we have to conclude that the world doesn't exist as a whole, either in itself or not in itself, right? So it's not a self-enclosed totality, right? The sum total of objects of possible experience is not, let's say, self-enclosed in the same way that maybe Spinoza's substance is, right? And this is an insight that has been found in Hegel through Žižek in particular. And part of the argument that I try to make is that it's also in Schelling as well. but for different reasons, is that this idea that the world isn't a totality opens up a new space for thinking about some of these fundamental problems, including the relationship between the infinite and the finite, right? So that's sort of the way that problem is oriented. And so it relates to emergence because, right? So when we're talking about the size and age of the world, we're talking about the possibility of an absolute beginning, right? When we're talking about the relationship between the causal order of mechanism and freedom, right? We're talking about the possibility of spontaneity in nature, right? And when we're talking about the absolute, we're talking about whether or not that absolute is of the world or outside of the world, if it's possible and if it's necessary, and how do we work through these things? So the idea then is that when you kind of combine some of that, you get the picture that a necessary condition for a kind of, right, cosmological metaphysical system, if it's going to emerge out of this, one of the things that has to be abandoned is the idea that there is this notion of totality, right, that necessarily constitutes the way we think about reality.
So obviously Kant is, I mean, again, it's just, he's almost like I would say overrated in some ways, but he's really not. He's really so important for so many things. So I guess, how does Schelling interact with Kant's system of reason and with these antinomies? How does he interact with it? In the book, you talk about the internal and not with the external addition. What is this bit of it as well? What is the part here?
Right. This is your question about the architectonic of pure reason. Yeah. Yes. So that's a slightly different conversation, because one of the things that he's trying to do in the architectonic of pure reason is, lay out how you would be able to have a complete system of philosophical knowledge, right? So he's going to talk about, he talks about the relationship between theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. My understanding of it, the way that I read it is, so the material that's proper to reason is what Kant calls ideas, right? And so there are three transcendental ideas for him: God, the soul, and the world, right? And these kind of concepts provide a regulative locus for organizing, right, the material of the understanding, which is conceptual, and the material of the imagination, which is intuitive. Right? So in order to, so I guess the broad point is, it grows internally because these three ideas are already regulative, what he calls regulative totalities. So they provide, again, kind of like I was talking about with the world earlier, a sort of horizon intelligibility under which these various concepts are systematized, right? But that's always going to occur internal to reason itself.
So it's not happening externally to that. It happens within reason. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. There's this idea that we have to organize it. And he directly compares this to an organism, right? He says that there's something organic about the system of reason in that it, right, grows and differentiates internally. Clearly some issues with that metaphor. We all know that organism and environment go together and all of this kind of stuff. But right. But no, I get the analogy though. So I guess here, so this is, I think, in the back half of the book, or towards the end of the book, you mention a few things. You talk about human freedom, you talk about being, you talk about some of the other aspects. So I guess here, for Schelling, how does being unfold with the world of spirit and nature, and how is there a living interpenetration? I think is the word you use. So could you just talk about how you understand this or see this?
Yeah. So after the identity philosophy, where Schelling's question is really, how are we best to understand the absolute, right, such that it is able to incorporate within itself both realism and idealism, and the real and the ideal, he sort of moves again back towards the question of, the birth of things and their relationship to the absolute, right? And one of the big things that happens in the freedom essay, right, is the division between ground and existence. And the idea that there's something about ground that gives way to existent things. And what I try to do then is, instead of focusing so much on the freedom essay, about which a lot has been written, is turn to these seminars that he gave in 1810 at Stuttgart. So they're called the Stuttgart seminars, the Stuttgart private lectures. And what he starts doing there is, well, he doesn't start doing it there. He was already using some of this language earlier, but yeah, it's trying to give a narrative of how we go from, right, the absolute to this, in a certain sense, world of differentiations, right? So the differentiation of spirit from nature, and the way in which they are distinct but grounded. That they have this is again the unity and differentiation that he's trying to pick out there. And one of the big innovations, you could say, in the freedom essay is this idea of evil, right? So we talked about this just briefly previously, but for Schelling, freedom is the ability to choose between good and evil, right? It's not reducible to that, but that's a very important aspect of it for Schelling. And in order to have that choice, evil must be, in some sense, real, right? But at the same point in time, evil cannot be a part of God, right? So there's this kind of question of God's, right, benevolence, and then God's omnipresence, right? So there has to be something that's in God that is not God, right? Such that there is this choice between, as he puts it in the Stuttgart seminars, between being and non-being. And the sort of working through of that choice, the struggle of that choice, is where, right, human existence finds its meaning. So that's kind of my first pass there. I saw some, you're not so happy with the theology.
No. I'm not very happy with this. I'm not happy with this. Okay. So I get the rationale, I think, right? I understand it, but I just don't. I don't entirely agree or disagree. So let me just real quick before I give my response here. Is this kind of the later Schelling where he starts throwing in all of his theology and his Jesus into things? So
this is a sort of this is another transitional point in Schelling's thinking. I guess one of the ways to understand the continuity of Schelling's thought is as a series of transitional points. But
a man of transitions, yeah.
In 1804, he gave a series of lectures where he began to talk about God more. In 1809, right, he publishes the Freedom Essay. And then in 1810, he loses his wife. His wife dies. And this really, really affects him.
Sure, yeah.
So he's doing the Stuttgart seminars after this. And then he writes a dialogue called Clara. It's a very beautiful dialogue. And then after that, right, he publishes an essay in 1812. And then he never publishes again in his lifetime. Wow. And he lived for another a good amount of time. He lived a long life.
He lived to 80 something, right? Or no, maybe close to it. 70 something. Yeah, he lived a long time.
And so what kind of begins to happen around this time is there's a transition that he himself marks. And he calls it, right, he differentiates between what he calls negative philosophy and positive philosophy. And the idea in general, he characterizes negative philosophy as the philosophy of the academy, right? So something like Spinoza is going to be, right, a peak negative philosopher, but also Hegel and Hegel's science of logic, right? And the idea that from within reason, one can provide the complete set of conceptual determinations of existence, right, in this self-enclosed way. What it fails to do is account for the thatness of experience, right? Negative philosophy can kind of tell us what things are and how they are, but it never gets to that question of existence itself. So he's going to say that the positive philosophy is a philosophy of life. And there's sort of, interest in the positive philosophy is growing, which is great. But at the same point in time, it is thoroughly religious, right? So in Sean McGraw's book that he recently published on this, he says that Schelling had a realization that the Bible was true, and that understanding the Bible as true, right, then sort of conditioned the way that he began thinking about the relationship between not just negative philosophy, right, but philosophy and history, right, something that exists external to philosophical determination. And for him, this is formulated on right around Christianity, which I mean really baffles me, right? I don't understand the taking of a historically contingent phenomenon and then generalizing it to the structure of history as a whole. And so I do have some very serious worries about what goes on in the positive philosophy. And this is in part why in the book, I try to provide a picture of the absolute and of God that can be drawn from the negative philosophy that in my understanding, or at least my opinion, is fundamentally not Christian, right? We're talking about a God that doesn't need to beget a son in order to punish himself and in order to suffer and in order to, right, become lacerated and to fall into itself. A God of imperfection, right? A God whose perfection is this kind of imperfection. So there is this way, I think, in the book where I want to push against some of that stuff in the positive philosophy, but I'm really not sure how it can be done. I don't know what a purely atheistic reading of the late Schelling would look like, and if it's even possible. So,
yeah, I wonder. I guess hard to know, right? But yeah, I wonder if maybe the death of his wife and maybe other things just kind of, and after sitting with this stuff for a while, he just wanted to make a switch. But it is strange to make that turn considering everything else he did, and it just conceptually terribly contradictory. And then that's not even getting into the historical and theological aspects, which is also, doesn't hold. I guess going back to the first thing you said, so I'm trying to remember what it was now about the evil thing. So there have been people that have argued this, that if God created the world and God created everything in it, and he's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, so he knows all things, he's all powerful, he's always there. In this way, there's nothing in the world that exists that doesn't come from him, which would include evil.
Right.
Now, depends on how you want to define evil, but I think if you take a human definition, that's all we have. you could say that conceptually that would make sense, but then that poses a hard contradiction of, well, if he's all good, how can you have evil coming from an all good God? If not, in fact, some aspects of evil are inherently good, at least as a precursor before their turn. Another way of saying this is, if evil comes from an all, good God, is evil simply a deterioration or some kind of way in which it's just distilled from good itself? So this is just kind of good gone bad, if you will, as it might happen. Maybe. Additionally, it's sort of a footnote here, but if that's the case, then maybe that explains some of the ways in which from on high God has determined, or has decreed, I should say, in various points, especially with the Jewish people in the Jewish nation in the Old Testament, decreeing they do evil acts towards other humans. Well, if evil is coming from good ultimately, then maybe it all connects and it all makes sense. But that, again, I mean, from a purely human perspective, which again is in some sense all we have, that's absolutely fucking ridiculous, and it makes no fucking sense to, I mean, on a whole lot of accounts. But even if you just stay with if you take out the problem of evil and suffering in the world and all that, which is, those are fair arguments, about the existence of God and things like that. But I don't think they're actually the strongest ones. But if you just take the kind of conceptual piece of it, you would then have to say evil and good are then the same thing, and they're categorically not. Which that doesn't make sense then to say an all good God. But then, okay, so maybe you would say, then maybe God's not all good. But then on an ontological perspective is, so there's things outside of God. But that can't be the case then. Because then where is it coming from if he's... So then it just starts to break down in all aspects of, well, maybe he's not all powerful. Maybe he's not all good. And maybe... he's not able to do those things. So then it's like, well, what kind of fucked up God is this anyways, if he's imperfect anyways? Now, and I will leave my get out of jail free card, right? I'm not going to do the whole, that's just how you have to have faith, because that's super lazy in my opinion. But maybe you could make the very lazy argument of, well, there's just things outside the mind of humans and the finite mind, and who can know the mind of God or whatever it is. And, sure. Great, that's fine. But then you can't, I mean, I guess you can, but then you're operating in two spheres of a finite mind, using finite tools, using finite rationality to explain something then that you would never know, which then would beget the question, why the fuck would you do that to begin with? Just work with the principles you have, and you could make speculations about it, but that wouldn't make any sense. So these are some of my reactions towards Schelling's obvious contradictory beliefs. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, so the one thing that I would mention is, for Schelling, that kind of, like you said, there would have to be something outside of God in order to account for evil, right? So Schelling he almost inverts the perspective, right? And he says that there's something in God that is not God, right? So in his later texts, right, as he's working through the ages of the world, from 1811 to 1815, he talks about the process by which God becomes God, right? By which God becomes the personal, the living God. Okay. And initially, right, we have this point at which, and like I put it earlier, where God kind of sits uncomfortably with God's self, because there is something in there that is, right, of God, but not God. And this is then where we have this division between, right, being and non-being, right? And in order to have a meaningful form of human freedom, there has to be that division. Because, for Schelling, in a certain sense, evil is, he describes it as, right, choosing, the personal will over the universal will, or something like that. So a Schelling scholar named Phoebe Page, I don't know if she's published this essay, but has made a wonderful argument that the notion of evil in Schelling is a form of anthropocentrism, right? When humans begin to understand themselves as the center of nature, right? As opposed to understanding that, in a certain sense, we're there on the periphery, right? Freedom is a struggle to find that kind of balance. And again, it does, I don't want to say that it's contradictory, but it is contrary to a certain theological picture that, Schelling is sort of working both within and against. And so the notion of God that he develops, particularly, right, the God before the beginning of the world, it's very different. It's not something that, I don't think it's something that's fully captured in the positive philosophy. So there's a question then of, why would he move away from it, right? So one of Žižek's favorite things that Schelling did was the second version of the Ages of the World, right? So in 1811, he starts this project. People say it was supposed to be his magnum opus, and it's supposed to be, the history of the world from past, present, and then future. And in all three drafts, he focuses on the past, and he never really gets to the present or the future. But in the 1813 version, which Žižek prefers, he describes the sort of, the God that exists before the world as this tumultuous, abyss of conflicting forces, right? This wheel that constantly spins. And Žižek is going to associate this with the unconscious. And then the way that conflict within the unconscious produces consciousness. And so, at these moments in Schelling, we have this, this just exactly this very confusing way of, almost talking about God in two separate senses. And then the question is, right, what are the virtues and vices of each of them, and what is, philosophically productive? And I find the, sort of, let's say, again, like I said, pushing against the grain of traditional theologies to be more interesting. So
yeah, I guess there's a few other things here. I guess on this is I'm not I wouldn't completely dismiss out of hand that you could say, does evil even exist? I think you can make an argument that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take out the supernatural for a minute. Tell me an action, or tell me a thought, or tell me a feeling that's evil. You could always describe it as a part of who we are as nature. Those are just the natural ways, and we project a certain system of values or morals or ethics on it, which is fine. That I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But that inherently, if you look at other organisms on the planet, they don't see, as far as we know, that's evil or that's not evil. Right. When certain animals, commit infanticide, they don't see it as evil or wrong, as far as we know. And you would make a determination that they probably wouldn't, because they continue to do it. There's a survival piece, and things just are. So if you take a kind of a evolutionary framework on this, so hurricanes aren't evil; they just are. It's a product of different things in the natural world. So then you could say, well, what about people that kill people or whatever? Well, people that torture people, is that evil? I don't know. Is it right? Should we do it? Those are very good questions to ask. But is it evil? Well, it's a product of being Homo sapiens on the planet with urges and instincts and drives over thousands of years, millions of years, that are doing these actions. We can still say they're right or wrong. That's a whole ethical, moral conversation. But is it evil? So you could make this kind of idea of saying, like, well, do we really? So in that sense, then, if you don't understand, if you don't think evil exists, but it's just more of there are things that are happening in the natural world and or the supernatural world that are or not, okay. But to me, what this feels like is this feels like, so on 2 points, this and the whole Schelling's idea of, well, maybe there's a part of non-God within God. Both of those points feel like the hermeneutical gymnastics that people do, right? Well, it's this, so maybe it's not this, so maybe it's not here, and maybe it's just not. Well, maybe there's a little bit of non-God in God. Like, what the fuck is that, right? Like, you can't start saying because you want something to fit an idea you have. Like, it doesn't work that way. We don't do that with other things. I mean, we do that with other things, but if you're taking first principles, if you're taking basic foundational things, like, that's not how it would be. And I'm not trying to advocate for a kind of black or white kind of thing or this overly rigid thing. Another point counter to this, which is also very obnoxious, is so there is definitely overlap philosophy has in many, many, many fields. This is, so I feel terrible because I'm always picking on Kierkegaard. This is my problem with Kierkegaard. I've said this in a few places. Yes. Can you look at the Abrahamic story, or can you look at elements of Christianity in a philosophical sense, right? Or this is like what other more modern thinkers do, where they try to look at the psychological nature of the biblical stories. Can you do that? Sure. But A, is that the author's intent? Is that the intention of these stories or these books? Which means you have to, I would believe you have to understand that first before you find alternative ways of trying to interpret it or trying to understand it. That's the first thing. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying it would behoove someone to do the work to do that first. Okay. And that doesn't mean everyone has to do that, but I think it's important. It's like if I write a letter to you, I have an idea in my mind that I'm trying to tell you, and I'm writing it down through symbols that we have as language. I have an intention there. It's not like, well, just take the letter and apply it however you want. That's not how that works. So again, it's not a complete analogy, but the second thing is that what are most of literally millions of people around the world understanding their history, their culture, their scripture, their all these things? They're not understanding it predominantly in this philosophical, psychological manner or whatever it may be, or historical manner purely. They're understanding it as holy scripture for many other things. And to then just, take that and say, well, I'm going to talk about Abraham, but I'm not going to talk about it in terms of the Jewish context in which that was written for Jewish people at this time. I'm just going to take it from my Danish perspective or my German perspective in this period and then just extrapolate whatever I want from it. You can do that, but I think it does a disservice if you don't do the other work first, because you could then just do that with anything. Do it with Shakespeare, do it with Milton, do it with, and I don't see the push for that. But, and lastly, the problem becomes when you're then building concepts off of something that had no intention to do that. It, to me, is weak. And I think you can build concepts without using that in that way. And so it seems as if Schelling is doing that here, maybe for various reasons. And I think Kierkegaard does the same thing. It's always, I've said this before, I'll read Kierkegaard and I'll be like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great. Anxiety, angst. Yep, this is great. And then I get to all the Jesus smuggling. I'm like, well, what are we doing? What are we doing? We don't need this. Like, you were doing so well. We don't need this stuff. Like, I don't understand. It's not. I never feel, maybe this is just my perspective, but I've read a handful of Kierkegaard. I never feel it's essential. It always feels tertiary. And it's like, so why are we doing this? And so I don't know if it's the same here with Schelling, but it seems totally just a total turn from all of the other stuff we've been talking about, where it's like, wait, what are you doing? Why are we doing this? I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to unpack. I have kind of two thoughts. I'm not going to be able to really answer your worry there, because
no. I'm just rambling now.
I myself find, a similar kind of uncomfortability with, particularly the just really Christian nature of a lot of idealist thought.
Yeah.
But so I guess in relation to some of your earlier comments about whether or not there's evil in nature, Schelling actually associates evil and disease, right? So disease is a kind of expression of the same imbalance that evil represents when we're talking about human action in nature, right? It's a sort of, for lack of a better way to put it, a deviation of the norm, right? The individual contracting into itself and away from the universal, right? In such a way that it doesn't really, participate in the, universal order, right? And so there is that. You wouldn't call it evil, right? But it does represent a, similar dynamic process to what we call evil in human beings, right? And then another thing that I think I'd want to point out is, we haven't really gotten the chance to talk about Schelling's notion of potencies.
Okay.
It doesn't factor particularly large into the book, but it's a really essential aspect of his philosophy, and it's difficult to do this, without visual aids. But in a certain sense, the idea is there's this sort of gradated sequence of relations and determinations, and that this system of potencies is an essential aspect of nature, right? Of transcendental philosophy, right? Of the coming to self-consciousness. But it also plays itself out in mythology, and it plays itself out in religion. So, when he turns to this later work and the positive philosophy, the sort of aspects of it are his philosophy of mythology, and then the philosophy of revelation. And because the potencies are, in a certain sense, the logical system of the absolute itself, right? The absolute always plays itself out in those potencies in all mythology, right? And in all theology. So it's this kind of, rubric for understanding that we participate in order to, right, be a process through which the absolute recognizes itself, right? And it's playing through those potencies. So I want to be fair to Schelling, where, it's not, I have very serious theological worries about some of the later work, but there is a way that he demonstrates the continuity of mythology from all over the world. He was a polyglot. He could, this is why his son had such a hard time collecting his works, because Schelling was commenting on so many different languages and all this kind of stuff, because he really does try to draw from various mythological systems and then show this kind of common logic. And that common logic is, for Schelling, best encapsulated in the relationship between God, Christ, and then, right, the resurrection. But, I think that maybe one could argue that, maybe it's an example and not the exemplar, right? So again, just to try to be fair to Schelling, I think that there are different ways of understanding this, but I do become very uncomfortable when we begin talking about, as I said earlier, the actuality of history and the relationship of history to philosophy when we take that narrowly theological view on what's going on. And there's some just really fascinating commentaries and works on this problem. But I think I'm alongside you where I have a hard time fully jumping in, right? And I say, it's almost like if this is the explanatory framework that we need to use in order to make sense of this problem, maybe it's the wrong explanatory framework. So that's kind of how I approach some of that. And also, Schelling doesn't really provide for us a moral system, right? As interesting as he was, as interested as he was in systematicity, he doesn't tell you what's good and what's bad and all of this kind of stuff. He just talks about evil as, again, a sort of imbalance in, what we might call, a certain type of world order or divine order. But the problem there is not, it's not some sort of like stupid Jordan Peterson, like chaos versus order thing, where if you choose chaos, it's bad, but you should choose order, right? It's about, again, participating in just the very complex dynamic of reality. And again, like participating it in such a way where, the individual will, the drive of the individual, where one at least recognizes that there's something larger than that, right? You might call that the divine will. We might call that the collective will, right? And there's this idea that it's a tension, it's a push and pull, right? The balancing of what Schelling calls being and non-being is going to be different in different instances. So, it's this almost, it's an ontology of evil. It's not a morality. That kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense.
Like I said, I do want to differentiate it. Like I said, I do share a lot of your concerns about some of these theological aspects, but there is, he's doing, he's drawing from various mystic thinkers, theosophical figures. Jacob is a really big figure for him. And so again, he provides for us, at least, on my reading at this point in time in his work, a very distinct picture of, what that sort of Christian narrative could look like, right? It's almost a philosophical religion.
I think what he's doing has some value and importance for sure, as you're laying out, to be charitable to him. Absolutely. And as I said, I don't think you cannot not do that. Yeah. I think it's maybe just an order of things of like that by itself is fine. But doing it in tandem with history, culture, theology, that's where it's like supremely problematic. It's not problematic, but it just doesn't, it gets super messy. So like if you have, and I guess I lean more on that. So like, as I've been saying, like you can do what he's doing and it's great. It's got a lot of value to it. I guess I lean less on that and more on the, the kind of, the importance of trying to understand the original intentions of which these things are hermeneutically contextualized is more where I place emphasis. But that could just be my own bias from my background and stuff. So, but I do think that's, I would kind of say it in I think kind of with anything of sorts of like, it's always a little bit different with, I guess, religious texts and history, but so I don't want to make a comparison of like something else because that would be weird. But like, people can do reinterpretations of like Romeo and Juliet but like there's a way in which it's designed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that you can't do it. Like, you can watch Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, and it's the very modernized whatever, and like that's great, and it's for what it is really good. It's really nice, but it's not like that we're getting that not having considered the original thing and how it was made and the whole thing, and so I guess that's not a good analogy, but that's somewhat similar to what I'm kind of saying.
Well, I'll flag that, earlier on, Schelling gave a series of lectures on the philosophy of art, and he engages with Shakespeare in part, and he does so through the same logic and structure of the potencies. Right? It's a very popular thing. If you were a German idealist, you had to give your taxonomy of all the different forms of art, right? And all this kind of stuff. Which one's the highest? How do we get there?
The aesthetic or whatever, right?
It was Hegel, right? Paintings of Jesus, or the apex of spirit's realization in art, all of this kind of stuff.
Right.
And those lectures very, heavily predate this later stuff. So he does work with some of that kind of artistic material that you're pointing out, with a very similar methodology.
That's fair.
So I think the question again are the Christian elements, are they foundational, right? Or is this kind of thing where, maybe as he got older, he got more conservative,
Right.
Maybe he had, a moment of conversion, like a rich moment of conversion. And he then began to apply that same logic to a different picture. While ultimately, right, attributing it, sort of, let's say, explanatory primacy or something like that. But I think it's an open question about how he got there and whether or not it's all presupposed in advance.
Yeah. No. I think that is fair. I didn't know that about the art in the Shakespeare piece. So that is, if there is some consistency there, or there's some elements to it, I think it is fair. And then you're right. I mean, he did live super long, so maybe as he got older, there was a shift. So
he absolutely loved Dante as well.
So let's see here. So I have 3 more questions I want to ask you.
Oh, great.
One's, I guess, a brief one, but we've mentioned at certain points, you mentioned in the book too, is Žižek has these 3 phases of Schelling's philosophy. Just what is Žižek's kind of way of categorizing that? Is that something that you agree with, or other Schelling scholars? And what was he trying to just do with the periods, I guess?
Right. So, basically what he's doing there is he's picking up on this, right? He didn't develop the claim about the 3 phases. But to kind of, put it briefly, the idea is that there's, the early period of his work, right, where he sort of begins thinking through certain Fichtean lines, and then he goes into the philosophy of nature, the system of transcendental idealism, and then the identity philosophy, right? And so even just trying to describe the quote unquote early Schelling, I'm sure you picked up from our previous conversation that there's a lot of distinctions going on there.
Yeah.
Right. So to call it a sort of self-contained, consistent period is very difficult. And then there's, the middle period, it's called the middle period in general, in which he's developing his philosophy of freedom, right? So the philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom, and then the Ages of the World project. And then there's the sort of third phase, which is the later Schelling, which is when he, turns, Sean McGraw calls this to turn to the positive. Right? So when he's talking about positive philosophy, the philosophy of mythology, and the philosophy of revelation from this sort of, historical, idiosyncratically historical perspective. And the reason why Žižek kind of pulls these pieces out is because he wants to talk about Schelling's political philosophy, which is there's a growing body of literature on this. It's been really, really interesting to read what people have been doing. But in the sort of earlier phase, what Žižek identifies is, a sort of faith in the state's ability to, provide us justice and good living and all of that. And then, in the middle phase that Žižek likes, in the philosophy of freedom, at least the way that I pick up on it, right? He wants to say that this is the radical political, I mean, because you know how Žižek works, right? We read this thinker and we find the radical kernel of their political thought and, you know, whatever it is. So he sees it there, and I can follow with some of that, particularly some of the stuff he talks about in Stuttgart about the problem with institutions. And so I do think that there's this abolitionist current that's going on there, and I don't know if I don't necessarily think it's novel, because in the oldest systematic program of German idealism, which was a very brief text, it comes out of from when Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling were all living together, right? It's written in Hegel's hand, but there's a lot of debate over whose thought it is. But even there, right, they say, you know, the goal is to go beyond the state, right? So there's a kind of perspective in there too about, you know, the shortcomings of what the state can provide. And then for Žižek, right, he's going to say that once we get to the later philosophy, we again have this, you know, almost conservatism that comes back in. And I think, and I talk about this briefly in the 6th chapter of the book, I don't think that it's an entirely fair picture, because, you know, in the late philosophy, he talks about this kind of reason that is in being itself, and the ability of institutions to align themselves with that kind of rationality of being. And then, you know, the various ways that you want to pick this apart, you know, complicated, but, you know, there's a line in the Philosophy of Revelations lectures from 1841 to 1842, where he talks about how, you know, he wants to, like, through philosophical religion, the establishment of a new kind of church that wouldn't even be recognizable from our current understanding of what a church is, right? So what's he talking about there? He's talking about how institutions are historical, right? And how they're constituted in certain ways, and how it's possible to constitute institutions in ways that don't resemble the institutions that we have in the present, right? And I do connect this to a certain abolitionist kind of thinking. So that's, again, that's what's going on with Žižek. That's why he does it. And I mean, it opens on, like I said, to this fascinating conversation about not necessarily just what it was Schelling's political thought, you know, but what kind of form of political thinking can we derive from some of these comments? Because it's funny. So I did a lot of psychoanalysis classes when I was in graduate school with Alan Bass, right? So Alan is, you know, translator of Derrida, but also very, you know, strict Freudian in his own way. You know, and he always had this line about how Freud never misses an opportunity to contradict himself. And I think that, you know, when you have a body of work as expansive as Schelling's, you know, that might happen, right? You know, you never miss an opportunity to contradict yourself. So it's a question of then looking through and saying, well, what matters to me? And right, highlighting that, placing intensity on it, putting it in context, and then right, drawing the lessons that can be learned from that. So, you know, it's this kind of almost, you know, reading Schelling against Schelling at certain points in time. And because he wrote so much on such a diverse range of topics, there's just ample opportunity for doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like how Žižek and some of the more maybe modern people writing on this are looking at the political angle of it and some of those aims, and then the idea about institutions. It is really fascinating. That's I think it's an interesting way to go down it. So one other question here is, you talk briefly, you can just kind of give the brief kind of, you know, summation of this, but this tripartite soul, you use it twice.
Tripartite soul.
Yeah. It just kind of explain. So obviously the first thing I think of is Plato, but explain what Schelling's doing here.
Yeah, no. So there's a lot of. I think there's aspects of Plato that fit in in an interesting way. But so the purpose of focusing on that, right, is so it's found in, again, the Stuttgart seminars from 1810. And what I wanted to do was use it as almost a kind of case study for showing, really putting on display this very complex relationship that the real and the ideal have sort of throughout his work. And so in the tripartite-tripartite division, what we can see is that when he's talking about nature and spirit, right, or when he's talking about the individual, right, Geist, spirit, it's not a mind-body dualism, right? He's not a mind-body dualist, because we have, these varying levels, the real and the ideal, and then some kind of force that balances between the two, right? That travels between the two, that seeks to find the proper balance between the two, right? So he starts with temperament, and, he's got this wonderful line about how it's sort of what's most profound in us. And temperament is, in a certain sense, a nostalgia for the past, right? A connection to nature, right? The nature from which, things came. And then it's also oriented towards the future, right? Through desire. And then, the second level is what he uses the French, he says l'esprit. And so, the idea there is that's where he kind of comes up with the more traditional divisions in German idealism of will and understanding. And then eventually, and again, right, at that level, there's this push and pull between the particular will, the universal will, right? So you have not only these two poles, and this is, I would say, some of the Platonic connection, right? When Plato talks about the daemon that's able to travel between the spirit world, right, and the world of the individuals, this is something that is, right, a component of each part, right, of the tripartite soul. So there's three parts. And then finally, right, he gets to the soul proper. And this is where he introduces reason and what's most universal, right, in the individual, and in the in the spirit. It's complicated to talk about because it's like spirit, but no, it's in French here, and then German. But yeah, the idea in focusing on that is really just to show how complicated Schelling's thinking about the relationship between the real and ideal sort of, becomes, or always latently was. So I wanted to give a case study because, sort of as I've outlined, it's really difficult to just pin down how to express this. So I wanted to sort of do it through his own analysis of what we as individuals are. So that's what's going on there. Yeah. And it's the chapter is slightly misnamed in the sense that the third part of the soul technically has four parts. Thanks Schelling.
Of course, making it more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's So I actually found that to be a really interesting part of the book to try to disentangle and see what's going on there. Yeah, and especially this idea of intemperament. Right, he talks about nostalgia and he talks about melancholy, right? And there's this sort of sadness and desire for the past that constitutes our ability to act. Right? I'm just going to say, this is the way that we affect. So
yeah. Well, look, I mean, we've been going at it for a couple hours, and it's been so much fun. What are some of the final things we can say about Schelling's, thoughts on the absolute and nature and realism and idealism, for his philosophy, and then also kind of for yourself, for folks that read your book, what do you want them to really understand about Schelling and Spinoza as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things is it has to do with the way that Schelling conceptualizes the absolute. Something that I do in the book and something that I do in my research is I'm really interested in reading Schelling and Hegel as fellow travelers. There's obviously this high-profile split between them. After Hegel died, Schelling took over his position, right, and gave some lectures on his philosophy, a very sort of insightful criticism. But I think that in Schelling's scholarship, sometimes the difference is overplayed. So I really wanted to demonstrate how when we adopt this notion of the absolute that's more commonly attributed to Hegel, right, as the unity of unity and division, how it allows us to think about monism in a different way. So that's then the connection back to Spinoza. In a certain sense, right, Spinoza is the foil for thinking through what's then unique about the kind of monism in the absolute for Schelling. And then, the hope is that once we have that more complex understanding of the absolute, we're able to better conceptualize this thing that's really hard to think about, which is the living, interpenetrating, right, mutual relationship between realism and idealism. So, at the end of the book, I say, when we return to Schelling, if we return to just his realism, we return to nothing but a corpse, right? Because it's without that living soul. And so, I want to just really entice people to look at both Schelling and look at this notion of the absolute as very relevant to these contemporary debates over realism and anti-realism and the rejection of idealism, the wholesale rejection of idealism. And again, in order to do that, one of the things that we have to leave behind is this dependence that I think that a lot of continental theory has on the categories of immanence and transcendence. Right? Because once we begin to understand the absolute in a way that's distinct from Spinoza's substance, we can see that those categories don't really do as much work as we want them to. Because, there's certain presuppositions about what has to be the case if we are going to call something either immanent or transcendent. Right? And this comes back to the notion of the fractured world, right? A kind of broken unity that lies at the core of these thoughts. So, it's sort of a call to, try to read Schelling in this sort of strategic, advantageous way, but also to not be afraid of the absolute, for lack of a better way to put it. How do we really bring that into conversation with these sort of contemporary philosophical developments?
Well, I think you do a fantastic job. It is a great read. Again, the book is called Schelling and Spinoza: Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute. Where can people find this, actually?
So you can find it online. I wouldn't say wherever books are sold. As the phrase sometimes goes.
Right.
But yeah, you can get it through the SUNY Press webpage. It's on. As loath as I am to mention the company, it is available on Amazon. They do have the discount there. But yeah, I'd encourage people to go online and find a locally owned bookshop in your area and ask them to order it, or contact your local library, ask them to order it.
And where can people find you and your work and any presence online?
I have. So some of my other essays are available on my academia.edu page. So if you just search Benjamin Norris philosophy, that comes up. I have a Twitter account. I very rarely tweet, but it's at Absolute Organ. And I think, that's about.
That's great. Hey, this has been so much fun. I always get a lot out of really long conversations, really in-depth conversations, especially about philosophy. And so this was such a joy. So I really appreciate you giving me your time and your energy for talking about this stuff. It's been a real treat.
Yeah, great, absolutely. Yeah, the book was sort of, in a certain sense, written in isolation. A lot of the work happened during the pandemic. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity to kind of discuss some of the thoughts that I was working through at the time. So yeah, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you.